If you've been watching this channel for a while, then you'll know that we just can't get enough of bad video games. We've spent many hours ranking games from worst to best, chronicling the most horrible games of each year, and even devoting time every fortnight to playing those that are worse than most.
But have you ever stopped to wonder which games rank as the most egregious of all time? You could go and look it up online, but why would you do that when we've done all the hard work for you and put it together in this handy-dandy hours-long video? You're welcome.
Before we get into our entries, it's worth clarifying the criteria that we've used to put this list together. We've trawled through the archives of both Metacritic and Game Rankings to find the 101 worst reviewed video games of all time. A title must have received at least 7 professional reviews in order to qualify, as it helps to ensure the averages are fair and not skewed by the views of one particularly grumpy critic.
Wherever a game's score differs between Metacritic and Game Rankings, we've gone with whichever one is lower. We must also remind you that this list is accurate at the time of writing, but although we are quite good, even we can't predict what future games will garner obscenely bad review scores, okay?
Finally, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice there are no games on this list released before 1999. Now, we just want to assure you that this hasn't been done on purpose, it's just that the 101 games with the worst review scores, and at least 7 professional reviews, happen to have all been released in 1999 or later. Go figure.
Now that all of that's out the way, I'm Ben.
I'm Peter.
And I'm Ashton from TripleJump, and here are the 101 worst games of all time.
Number 101, Armorine's Project Swarm, 29.88%. Cripes, you know things are going to be bad when the game at 101 didn't even manage to scrape 30 out of 100. You'd better buckle up, boys and girls. It's going to be a rough ride. Released in 1999, Armorine's Project Swarm, or Armorines if you want to get European and or early appearance from Simon Miller about this, was a first-person shooter based on the Armorines comic book. The story focuses on the exploits of the Armorines, a military branch outfitted with special suits that are designed to be virtually indestructible. Players take on the role of one of 2 playable protagonists, Tony Lewis or Myra Lane, and are tasked with protecting Earth from the spider-like extraterrestrials that have invaded. Though the game's premise doesn't sound too bad on paper, in reality the whole thing was a shambles. Critics complained of poor quality graphics, frame rate issues, and frequent long load times, as well as unfair design and gameplay mechanics that often left them falling to their deaths or confused as to what their mission objectives were. To add insult to injury, the game was utterly bland, providing players with nothing more to do than wander through linear levels and blast enemies. Admittedly, that's sometimes all you're after from a game, but with so many other better options to choose from, there really was no reason for anyone to pick up a copy of Armorines. Number 100. X Rebirth, 29.8%. There are some games out there that are bad because they're technically inept, but if you look beyond the bugs and glitches, you'll find a solid experience that's truly worth your time. X Rebirth was not an example of such a game, as beyond its technical inadequacies, it was a galaxy full of bland. X Rebirth focuses on pilot Ren Otani as he and his co-pilot Yisha bop around space in order to try to take down an evil mining corporation. That sounds quite exciting, but players soon got bored of being forced to spend several minutes at a time traveling from place to place. Once they reached their intended destination, things got no better, as the interface was so poorly designed that players often couldn't find what they were looking for. The lack of traditional menus was meant to increase immersion, but all it did was frustrate. So, we've got a bland game that's hard to navigate. Anything else? Well, yes, actually, X Rebirth wasn't just boring, it was also fundamentally broken. Critics reported frequent crashing and tons of bugs, so even if flying mindlessly through space with nothing to do was your cup of tea, the game would have probably collapsed in on itself before you'd even gotten your spaceship out of your space garage. Number 99. Soda Drinker Pro, 29.44%. Are you looking for a game that replicates the experience of drinking your favorite carbonated beverage but costs several times as much as a can of the stuff? Then you need Soda Drinker Pro in your life. I am joking, no one needs Soda Drinker Pro in their life. The game was made up of 102 levels, and in each, players were tasked with drinking enough fizzy pop to empty their soda meter. That is all there is to it. Well, aside from the hidden game Vivian Clark, which is basically a low-rent WarioWare. Critics were, unsurprisingly, not very kind to Soda Drinker Pro. The gameplay, for the most part, was monotonous and dull, and although Vivian Clark did offer players a bit of variety, it didn't provide much of a challenge. If the lack of anything meaningful to do didn't put players off, then the visuals surely would have. We appreciate that the game was developed by just one man, but we're also aware that lone developers have been able to churn out titles like Undertale, so that excuse doesn't really wash, does it? We're not sure if Soda Drinker Pro was developed with the intention of being so bad it's good, but the takeaway here should just be that it's really, really bad. Number 98. ESPN Sports Connection, 29.29%. When the good folks down at Nintendo released Wii Sports in 2006, they couldn't possibly have known that their creation would inspire a parade of pale imitations. One such tragic clone was 2012's ESPN Sports Connection for the Wii U, a game that was effectively what you'd get if you ordered Wii Sports from Wish. ESPN Sports Connection offered players the opportunity to play a number of popular sports from the comfort of their own homes. With that said, we'd hate to imply that the experience of playing any one of the minigames was in any way like actually going out and kart racing, or playing football, baseball, or any other of the sports the game claimed to replicate. Not only was the interactivity minimal and the gameplay repetitive, but ESPN Sports Connection also offered players no kind of progression system. There was nothing to unlock, and the AI was painfully stupid, which made it insultingly easy. It was also plagued with technical issues, and if you were masochistic enough to force it upon your friends, the game would suffer from severe slowdown. The bottom line was that everything ESPN Sports Connection tried to do had already been done before, and in most cases, far better. Number 97. Hoodwink, 29%. Now don't get us wrong, we've got absolutely nothing against short games. In fact, we've previously dedicated entire lists to recommending great games that you can finish in less than an evening. With that said though, we simply cannot stand by and watch whilst a demo-length title is sold for an exorbitant amount of money, as was the case with 2012's Hoodwink. If a short runtime had been Hoodwink's only problem, then critics might not have given it such a bashing, but if anything, the fact that it only lasted for around an hour was about the only thing the game had going for it. The story follows the light-fingered Michael Bezel, Bezel? You get it? As he attempts to steal the items he needs to propose to his girlfriend Francesca. There were other plot threads that were hinted at along the way, but the game never really did anything with them. Presumably the studio had plans for a sequel, though thanks to the shoddiness on display in Hoodwink, no such game ever materialized. As though its short runtime and poorly constructed narrative weren't enough, Hoodwink also suffered from camera issues and a serious lack of creativity when it came to its puzzles. Some critics did manage to find some praise for its art style, but that on its own wasn't enough to make the game worth playing. Number 96. Ark Survival Evolved, 29%. If you're a fan of survival games and wouldn't mind seeing how you'd get on living in prehistoric times, then we heartily recommend that you give Ark Survival Evolved a go. It isn't the absolute best game in the world, but it is hours of base building and dinosaur taming fun for the whole family. Whatever you do though, do not play it on the Nintendo Switch. Ark was originally released in August 2017 for the PS4, Xbox One and PC, but it didn't get a Switch port until November 2018. Suffice it to say, the developers shouldn't have bothered. As the name might suggest, the aim of the game is survival, and players must build themselves a base and defend it from both animal and human adversaries, all whilst keeping tabs on their vital stats. Players can also tame a variety of creatures, both real and mythical, and use them as transportation to explore the world. If all of this sounds like fun, well, it is, on PlayStation, Xbox or PC. Sadly, the Switch version of the game was downgraded in basically every way to allow it to run on the console. The resolution and frame rates were poor, the textures were blurry, and the game suffered from painfully long load times. Number 95. 13, 29%. There are some games out there that are in dire need of a remake. Then there are some, like 2003's 13, that should have been left well alone. The original 13 was a pretty good first-person shooter, and critics enjoyed its comic book-style graphics and fun gameplay. It earned review scores in the low to mid-70s, and though it didn't sell particularly well, it did gain a cult following. The 13 remake, on the other hand, was a complete mess from start to finish. The story of the 13 remake was the same as the original. A man with amnesia awakens on a beach and attempts to find his identity, soon finds himself entangled in a conspiracy to overthrow the government, and discovers that he's wanted by the FBI for the assassination of the US president. Not only was the remake plagued by bugs, glitches, and audio issues, and for imposing a weapon limit upon players, but it also caught a lot of flack for the changes made to the art style, which was one of the best things about the original. Developer PlayMagic's former staff blamed the company's CEO Giuseppe Crugliano for the problems, accusing him of mismanagement and creating a toxic working environment. He naturally disputes these claims, though admits that there were cash flow problems during the game's development. See? There's your problem, Giuseppe. If you don't pay your staff, they'll churn out a crappy game. Number 94. Tiny Racer, 29%. Oh boy, or girl or other, wasn't 2020 a terrible year for video games? It's certainly lucky that everything else was going so well. Tiny Racer is a game that does exactly what it says on the tin. You, the player, choose from one of several miniature vehicles and then race your opponents around a number of tracks for 3 laps at a time. If the game had done this competently, then it might have gone down better with critics, but it couldn't even get the basics right. For starters, none of the karts had different stats, so that choice was entirely arbitrary. Once on the track, things didn't get much better. Although the controls were straightforward, there were no power-ups or anything else to distinguish Tiny Racer from its scores of competitors. When it came to the actual racing, the shoddiness continued. The game's various bugs would see the karts frequently tumbling over one another and the side rails, and the camera didn't help matters since the downward angle made it difficult for players to see what lay ahead. Technically, Tiny Racer was functional, but numerous bugs, ugly UI, irritating music, and a complete lack of identity made it impossible to recommend to anyone. Number 93. Game Party 2, 29%. Before we get into this one, we want you to commit the bad name of Game Party to memory, because the series is going to appear on this list not once, but twice more. How does that feel, Game Party? Taking up almost 3% of a list of the 101 worst games ever made. Shameful. The least egregious of the 3 Game Party titles on our list is 2008's Game Party 2, a collection of minigames that was sure to get the party started, if the guests at the party were the sort of people who got excited by tasks like data entry or inventory management. Indeed, if you liked dull, monotonous, and repetitive tasks, then you'd have probably enjoyed Game Party 2, but if you preferred your games to be, fun, then you'd have wanted to avoid it like the plague. Though Game Party 2 boasted a whopping 11 minigames, several of these were featured in the original Game Party, so only a handful were new. Plus, they all boiled down to repeatedly making one of 3 gestures with the Wiimote. The audio-visual presentation did nothing to endear Game Party 2 to players either, as everything was bland and generic, from the me look-alike characters to the insipid royalty-free soundtrack. We can't actually say for sure whether or not it was royalty-free, but it sure as hell sounded like it. Number 92. Duke Nukem Critical Mass, 29%. It seems like 2011 was a bad year for poor old Duke Nukem. After 14 years of development hell, Duke Nukem Forever released to a very tepid response. Though, with that said, it wasn't cold enough to earn it a spot on this list, so bravo, I suppose. Then, as if to add insult to injury, fans had to put up with the appalling Duke Nukem Critical Mass as well. The shooter was first released in Europe in April of 2011 before making its way to the rest of the world a couple of months later. Not sure what we Europeans did to deserve such punishment, but oh well. In terms of story, Critical Mass is set following the disappearance of an Earth Defense Force agent and special team. Fearing the worst, the EDF decides, perhaps ill-advisedly, to send in Duke Nukem to sort out the whole sorry mess. The gameplay was largely run and gun, though the developers did try to keep things entertaining by rotating between first-person, third-person, and top-down views of the action. Critics gave the developers a few points for trying, but that's really where the praise ended. The game was ugly, repetitive, and lacked any of the charm of the previous Duke titles. Hell, even the D-Man's witty one-liners were watered down to appease the rating gods. It seems like developer Apogee needs to make a serious apology for this one. Got 'em. Number 91. Wild West Online, 29%. In 2018, an open-world Wild West-themed game released to universal critical acclaim, garnering a near-perfect score of 97 out of 100 on Metacritic. It won countless awards and is often cited as being one of the best games of all time. As though to keep the universe in perfect balance, another open-world Wild West-themed game was released in 2018, and that one was utter plops. We'll get the good stuff out of the way first. To its credit, Wild West Online did have a very large open world. Actually, thinking about it, I'm not sure if large is really a compliment. After all, if you ordered a large bucket from KFC but it didn't contain any fried chicken, then you probably wouldn't be very happy. Anyway, I suppose what I'm trying to get at is that Wild West Online didn't have very much in the way of content. The character creator was lacking in options, the missions were dull and repetitive, and the story was basically non-existent. What Wild West Online did have, though, were hundreds and hundreds of microtransactions, which effectively made the game pay to win, and we all know how we here at Team TripleJump feel about that. If it had been released as a beta, then critics might have been a little more forgiving, but Wild West Online claimed to be a full and finished game, one with too many microtransactions and not enough fried chicken.
Number 90, NFL Blitz 2003, 29%. Oh yeah, here we get... Ben's just finished talking, he'll be really cross if I do that. Sports time. In the early 2000s, it seemed the world was bonkers for American football video games, but the fact there was an abundance of them doesn't mean they were all good. In fairness to NFL Blitz 20-03, its GameCube, PS2 and Xbox versions weren't half bad. Sure, they weren't up to the standards of the likes of Madden NFL 2003 or NFL 2K3, but they were, at the very least, playable. Sadly, the same cannot be said for the Game Boy Advance version of the game, which received a critical crucifixion. Admittedly, this was partly down to the capabilities of the Game Boy Advance itself, but with that said, only so much of the blame can be levelled at the handheld. After all, titles like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 proved you could lose some features and still be a fantastic handheld game. The game's mechanics were laughable and were nothing like the game's home console counterparts, the artwork and character animations were unforgivably bad, and the AI was completely broken. NFL Blitz, more like NFL shit. Number 89. Puzzle Bobble Versus, 28.73%. Was this a mobile game on a TripleJump list? Oh, scandalous! As much as Nokia liked to push the idea that the N-Gage was a handheld console, it really was just a mobile phone with the capability of playing a handful of games. Unfortunately for titles like Puzzle Bobble Versus, though, Nokia's insistence that the N-Gage wasn't just a phone meant that its games were judged in the same way as their Game Boy Advance brethren. Puzzle Bobble Versus, as the name might suggest, was a puzzler spin-off of the 1986 arcade platformer Bubble Bobble. Gameplay consisted of launching coloured bubbles into a play area populated by other coloured bubbles, and matching them in order to make them disappear. The overall aim was to make all of the bubbles vanish without having them cross the line. The first problem with Puzzle Bobble Versus was that it was incredibly short and could be completed in less than 30 minutes. It was also insultingly easy, the levels were repetitive and dull, and the low-quality graphics made it almost impossible to see what was happening on screen, which I suppose did add a bit of a challenge to the title, but not really the sort that players were hoping for. The final nail in Puzzle Bobble Versus' coffin, though, was the fact that it didn't even have a single-player mode, so players had to force the game onto others, which earned them absolutely no friends. Number 88, NFL Quarterback Club 2000, 28.63%. Well, look at this. It's always the way. You wait ages for a bad American football game, and then two come along within a couple of entries of each other. As if to prove my point that not all turn of the millennium football games were winners, here's NFL Quarterback Club 2000 for the Sega Dreamcast. This one can't even fall back on the hardware excuse either, as both the Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 versions were utter plops. Part of the problem was the fact that Sega's NFL 2K was just so darn good that everything else of the American football persuasion drew comparison. And in the case of QB Club 2000, the comparison was not favourable. Firstly, it looked absolutely horrible. The graphics would have only just been passable at the beginning of the generation. Some of the animations were quite interesting, but there were very few of those, and this meant the same ones were repeated over and over, making the experience very boring for players. Still, poor visual presentation can be somewhat forgiven if the gameplay is fun. But QB Club 2000 lacked inner beauty as well as outer. Among the complaints were dumb AI, clunky controls, and copious bugs. Astonishingly, the game didn't signal the end for the NFL Quarterback Club series, though this tale doesn't have a happy ending, as things didn't exactly get better in later entries. Thankfully though, sports fans haven't been tormented with a release in this franchise since 2001. Number 87, Conspiracy Weapons of Mass Destruction, 28.5%. Every so often, a game will be released that has received minimal fanfare prior to launch, and yet still blows critics and players away with all it has to offer. Others, like 2005's Conspiracy Weapons of Mass Destruction, slip out into the world with very little hype, presumably in the hopes that no one will notice them and therefore fail to realise what utter tosh they are. Conspiracy's issues were many. First of all, there was the story, which couldn't have been blander or more generic if it had tried. Players jumped into the woefully cliched shoes of Cole Justice, yes, really, a mercenary and ex-Secret Service agent on one last assignment, which sees him trying to take down the rogue government agency, Hydra. Again, yes, really. If the problems had ended at Conspiracy's weak story, then things might not have been so bad, but the gameplay fared no better. The level design was uninspired, overly linear and repetitive, the visuals were outdated, and the voice acting was painful to listen to.
I'm not sure what Hydra do here, but as long as I'm paid, I don't care.
The forced stealth sections also did nothing to endear the game to players, nor did the stupid AI. Often you'll hear us say that a game could have been good with a bit more love and attention. In the case of Conspiracy Weapons of Mass Destruction, though, the kindest thing the devs could have done for it would have been to take it out back and shoot it in the face. Number 86, Stephen King's F13, 28.41%. If you're perusing a bookstore and you come across a title with the name Stephen King splashed across it in big letters, you can probably bank on the fact it's going to be half decent. Alas, the same cannot be said of video games bearing the Master of Horror's name, as Stephen King's F13 proved. This somewhat bizarre title wasn't a single game, but rather several mini-games bundled together with some screensavers, sound effects, desktop wallpapers, and a copy of King's novella, Everything's Eventual. We'll get the praise out of the way first. Everything's Eventual wasn't a bad story, but had previously been published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and would later appear in King's 2002 collection, also called Everything's Eventual, so it wasn't like F13 was the only place to find it. The actual games, on the other hand, were laughable. Both Bug Splat and Whack-A-Zombie were variations on Whack-A-Mole and became tedious in a matter of seconds. And No Swimming simply tasked players with feeding a series of creatures to piranhas, which would start smashing the screen if they didn't get their chow in a timely manner. As one reviewer rightly pointed out, the only scary thing about Stephen King's F13 was its $30 price tag, which, if you're wondering, equates to over $50 in today's money. Number 85, Orion Dino Beatdown, 28.33%. According to old Billy Shakes, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. If that's truly the case, then Orion Dino Beatdown, regardless of whether it's calling itself that, Orion Prelude, or Orion Dino Horde, would still smell vaguely of poo. Orion Dino Beatdown was originally launched as a mod for Half-Life 2, before being developed into a game in its own right. In terms of its premise, it was an online cooperative shooter in which teams of up to 5 players banded together to fend off waves of dinosaurs and protect a generator. Though on paper the game sounds just fine, in practice it was a huge mess. The main problem with Dino Beatdown was the fact it was absolutely riddled with bugs, glitches, and other such technical problems. Players complained of clipping and frame rate issues, as well as a bug that prevented them from spectating once they'd been killed, leaving them with nothing to do but twiddle their thumbs for a few minutes. Additionally, many players experienced problems with actually joining a game server, though the jury is out on whether that was due to technical issues or just the fact that nobody actually wanted to play the darn thing. Number 84, Rhythm and Notes Improve Your Music Skills, 28.29%. Over the years, video games have gotten a bit of a bad rap from concerned folks who claim that they're turning players' brains to mush. With that in mind then, it's always nice when a game comes along that claims it will teach us something, if for no other reason than to prove the naysayers wrong. See, I told you, Mom! Still, most edutainment games are roughly as fun as an afternoon at the dentist, and Rhythm and Notes Improve Your Music Skills, or Tsunami Rhythm and Notes if you want to get British about this, was no different. The goal of Rhythm and Notes Improve Your Music Skills is right there in the title. The game attempted to educate players in the realms of, you guessed it, rhythm and notes. Sadly though, it failed even on that front, as the so-called lessons would simply play a series of chords at the player and just expect them to identify them without any prior instruction. On the flip side, the rhythm part of the game was insultingly easy, tasking players with nothing more than listening to a beat and then getting them to repeat it back by tapping the stylus on the touchscreen. Overall, Rhythm and Notes Improve Your Music Skills was neither useful as an instructional tool, nor was it a fun game to play. Number 83, Monster Trucks DS, 28.22%. We've seen some games that push the boundaries between homage and downright plagiarism in our time, but it isn't often that we come across a game that's literally just a reskinned version of another one. The kicker is that ATV Quad Frenzy, the game from which Monster Truck DS took all of its assets, wasn't even very good in the first place. According to its description, Monster Trucks DS offered players the chance to race one of 8 different vehicles around a whopping 25 all-terrain tracks. Whilst all of that may well be true, none of it was worth actually doing. The first issue was the driving itself. Because the Monster Trucks were just reskinned quad bikes, they handled in a really weird way and were less responsive than players were expecting. Monster Trucks DS was also severely lacking in the presentation department, with critics complaining that its interface was less than user-friendly. The game also came under fire for its poor progression system, which failed to give players any indication of how well they were doing. The bar was already pretty low for Monster Truck DS, but it still managed to limbo under that bad boy to the horror of anyone unfortunate enough to play it. Number 82, Shell Shock 2 Blood Trails, 28.19%. It's a fallacy that you need tons of money to make a good game. Titles such as Terraria and Hollow Knight were made for a relatively small amount of cash, and they're both fantastic. So why did Shell Shock 2 Blood Trails have such a rough time of things? Well, the answer is probably that it tried to break into a genre that was A, already oversaturated, and B, oversaturated with some really good AAA titles. The story of Shell Shock 2 Blood Trails follows Nate Walker, a US soldier during the Vietnam War, as he desperately tries to find his brother Cal. Cal is entangled in some nefarious testing program, and so not only does Nate have Viet Cong to deal with, he also has to stave off flesh-eating zombies as well. And if all of that sounds bat plops to you, well, it was. Yeah, you bang on. Things didn't get much better from there, as Shell Shock 2 failed to cultivate anything in the way of atmosphere, instead serving players level after level of bland. There was some good news for citizens of Australia though, as Shell Shock 2 Blood Trails was so violent, it was refused classification, therefore sparing Aussie gamers the pain of experiencing it. Silver linings, eh? Number 81, Mistmare, 28.14%. Prior to finding out it was an utterly rubbish video game, if you'd asked us what a Mistmare was, we probably would have told you it's what happens on a cold winter's morning when you're late for work and your car fails to successfully defog the windscreen. Released in June 2003 for the PC, Mistmare was an action RPG set in an alternate timeline. One in which the Industrial Revolution never happened, and so, despite it being the year 1996, things are still looking pretty medieval. A deadly fog has cut off the north of Europe from the south, and it's up to the monk Isidore to figure out what's happening and put a stop to the evil before it's too late. Although the story wasn't bad, everything else about Mistmare was sorely lacking. Critics found the RPG elements to be convoluted, to the point where it was difficult to figure out what each stat affected and how to improve them. The time management system, which only allowed players to perform certain actions at certain times of day, also caught a lot of flack. Players would find themselves trying to kill time just so they could get to a time when they could do something of interest. Mistmare was so poor, in fact, it was one of only 3 games, the others being Postal 2 and Dungeon Lords, to receive a 0-star review from Computer Gaming World. Now that has got to sting.
Number 80, Ping Pals, 28%. Allow me, dear viewers, to paint you a picture that may give you an idea as to why 2004's Ping Pals was so crap. Imagine buying a computer that comes with Microsoft Paint pre-installed. Then, imagine going online and paying tens of dollars for a piece of software that was quite similar to Microsoft Paint, except it only allows you to draw in shades of brown, and doesn't come with half of the tools. You wouldn't do that, right? Well, that, my friends, is the exact reason why people were so upset with Ping Pals. The game, if it can be called that, was a chat program for the DS that allowed players to send messages to other DS users, as long as they were within 100 feet of each other, and to trade digital items in order to complete collections. By playing the game, players would accrue coins, which they could then use in an in-game shop. This all sounds fine, but it's worth remembering that the DS came with a chat program pre-installed, one that had several features that Ping Pals lacked. It's for this reason that critics had no time for Ping Pals, and they all agreed that the game was a complete waste of time. In fact, Ping Pals was so rubbish that one reviewer decided not to bother going into details, and instead just published a note with nothing more than the word pointless handwritten on it. Number 79, Godzilla Unleashed, Double Smash, 28%. Whilst the DS was a neat little machine that had a few brilliant titles, I don't think it's unfair to say that it also had its fair share of crud as well. Case in point, Godzilla Unleashed, Double Smash. The game was of the side-scrolling smash-em-up variety and saw players taking control of either Godzilla or Mothra, though why anyone would want to bother with the latter is beyond us. The simplistic gameplay consists of nothing but punching, kicking and atomic breathing your way through a variety of enemies. A big plane, a little plane, a big boat, a little boat and a cardboard box. The last one I just throw in for funsies, because Lord knows there's no enjoyment to be found anywhere else in Double Smash. Unsurprisingly, critics found the game to be tedious, repetitive and slow-paced, which is the last thing you'd want from a game about a giant lizard that goes around smashing things up with reckless abandon. In addition to all of that, Double Smash was also insultingly easy and too short to justify the price tag. Plus, the story mode lacked a save mechanic. Number 78, Sneakers, 28%. Now, we would hate to imply that the developers of 2002 Sneakers in any way ripped off the character design of the game's protagonist from the masterpiece that was Stuart Little, but yeah, I mean, they're basically identical, aren't they? Sneakers, or Next Mix Have a Nice Day if you want to get Japanese about this, was a game sold exclusively in Toys R Us in North America. The game stars an anthropomorphic mouse named Apollo, as he and his mouse pals embark on a quest to save one of their mouse brethren who's been kidnapped by a pack of dastardly rats. A game in which players are forced to traverse a human-sized world as tiny characters could have been brilliant. I mean, just look at It Takes Two for evidence of that. But dull gameplay made Sneakers a snooze fest. Most of the game was on rails, and players had to do nothing more than scout out rats and look at them until they ran away. Occasionally, some combat was peppered into the proceedings, but the fights were slow and far too easy. Take it from us, you'd have been far better taking that $30 you'd have spent on sneakers and using it to buy a pair of actual sneakers so that you could run as far away from this game as humanly possible. Number 77, Thundercats, 28%. If you grew up in the 1980s and have fond memories of the TV series Thundercats, then we're going to ask you to close your eyes and stick your fingers in your ears for the next entry. We'd hate to be responsible for ruining anyone's childhood. In 2011, the Thundercats returned to television screens in an all-new series, which went down pretty well with long-time fans. Naturally, where there is a successful TV show or movie, a cruddy video game is sure to follow. And follow it did, with 2012's Thundercats for the Nintendo DS. Throughout the side-scrolling beat-em-up, players controlled Lion-O and were tasked with nothing more than swinging a sword at waves of identical enemies. Make it through each stage, and you'll be rewarded with an insultingly easy boss to fight. To call the game repetitive would be an understatement. It was level after level of the exact same thing. Thundercats also suffered from many of the other symptoms of bad game-itis as well, with outdated graphics and a ridiculous number of bugs and glitches, including one that not only caused the game not to save, but would also wipe what save data there already was. Thundercats ho! More like Thundercats no! Got 'em and all that. Oh yeah. You can all take your fingers out of your ears now! Number 76, American McGee presents Bad Day LA, 28%. We all have the occasional bad day, but I can't imagine many of us have had as many back-to-back as American McGee clearly did whilst developing Bad Day LA. Getting up on the wrong side of the bed for months is the only reason we can come up with as to why this game ended up being such a pile of steaming tosh. Bad Day LA tells the story of former Hollywood agent Anthony Williams who, whilst living on the streets of LA, witnesses a terrorist attack during which a plane full of chemicals is crashed into an overpass, turning several of the city's inhabitants into zombies. His day gets worse from there, as whilst trying to escape the city, a string of disasters befalls it, and Anthony becomes something of a reluctant hero. McGee intended for the game to be satire, however, the mark on that was missed by a country mile. The game's crass humour fell completely flat, often bordering on offensive, which might not have been as big of a problem if the gameplay hadn't also sucked. Bad Day LA was linear, almost to the point of being on rails, repetitive and wildly unbalanced, with players finding that most weapons were damn near useless, and the ammo was far too scarce. Throw into the mix a bunch of bugs and glitches, and you've got a game that really should have phoned in sick. Number 75, Mortal Kombat Special Forces, 28%. I don't think it's unfair to say that the Mortal Kombat franchise has had its ups and downs over the years. The vast majority of games in the main series have been well received by both critics and fans, but there have also been the odd dud, such as Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero and the focus of this entry, Mortal Kombat Special Forces. Unlike its predecessors, Mortal Kombat Special Forces was not a fighting game, but rather a third-person action-adventure. The game is set before any of the others and follows Jax Briggs as he attempts to prevent Kano and his gang, the Black Dragon, from getting their hands on the Eye of Chitian, an artifact of immense power. We'll get the good stuff out of the way first. Mortal Kombat Special Forces was a budget title, and therefore didn't cost very much to buy. Still, just because something's cheap, it doesn't mean that it's a good deal. After all, you wouldn't buy a steaming pile of garbage just because it's only a $5. Mortal Kombat Special Forces is the steaming pile of garbage in this analogy. Critics admonished the game's weak storyline, lackluster graphics, and soulless gameplay, asserting that even at its low price, it just wasn't worth playing. Trust us when we say, kids, no Mortal Kombat is better than this Mortal Kombat. Number 74, Dragon Ball Evolution, 28%. We come now, ladies, gentlemen, and others, to the first of many horrible movie tie-in games on this list. What's quite interesting about Dragon Ball Evolution on the PSP, though, is that, according to critics at least, it was actually better than the film that it was based on. I'd like to assure you that it's still gosh darned awful, but you know us, we like to find the silver linings in situations, so there it is, I suppose. Dragon Ball Evolution was a game of the fighting persuasion, and plot-wise was based on the film of the same name. It follows protagonist Goku and friends as they embark upon a quest to defeat the evil Lord Piccolo before he can get hold of the titular Dragon Balls and use them to assume power over the whole planet. Sounds great, and it is in manga and anime. The movie and game, not so much. Critics panned Dragon Ball Evolution upon its release in 2009. Although some praised the game for its fast-paced action and multiple gameplay modes, most agreed that it didn't have much to offer besides that. The graphics were awful, even for a handheld game, the AI was incredibly hit and miss, and there was no finesse to the gameplay, with one critic even claiming that just mashing the one button would allow players to win most of the time. Number 73, The Arse Kickers, 27.86%. Here's a pro tip for anyone in the business of naming video games. If you're going to call the game something like The Arse Kickers, then you'd better make bloody well sure that it does exactly what it says on the box. No prizes for guessing that 2011's The Arse Kickers did not, in fact, kick ass. According to its description on Metacritic, The Arse Kickers was an ode to the classic beat-em-up titles from the 80s like Streets of Rage, Kung Fu Master, and Double Dragon. Sure, the game was a 2D beat-em-up, but that's more or less where the comparison ends. As The Arse Kickers was to the likes of Streets of Rage, what that horrible celebrity cover of Imagine was a John Lennon's original. In a word, appalling. The Arse Kickers scored some points for its artwork, which did look quite cool, but beyond its aesthetics, it was a shallow mess of a game. The controls were too simplistic, the enemies were dull and repetitive, and the environments, whilst nice looking, were quite empty. Those issues would be enough to earn the Arse Kickers a bad game badge all by themselves, but it was also plagued by bugs and glitches. The game did nothing to update the genre's formula, and when compared to most of the retro titles that were still available to play, it was nothing more than a pale imitation. Number 72, Terminator 3, War of the Machines, 27.67%. Prepare yourselves, dear viewers, as it's time once again to take a walk down movie tie-in alley. Try to walk fast, don't look at the games in the eyes, and if any of them try to approach you, do not engage them. Based on Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, Terminator 3 War of the Machines was a first-person shooter with heavy emphasis on online multiplayer. People could choose to side with either the humans or with Skynet, and were then tasked with dispatching their opponents in a team deathmatch or holding or overturning an area in the objective-based mission mode. The game had a plethora of problems, but chief among them was the poor online multiplayer. You know, the main thing the game claimed to do. The limited online servers prevented the players from easily finding a multiplayer game, and so most ended up stuck with the pathetic single-player mode. Even if they did manage to get online, things got no better. The game's levels were poorly designed, and so players often found themselves running into dead ends. The graphics and animations were inexcusably low quality, and the sound fared no better. Suffice it to say that Terminator 3 War of the Machines was a game that could have only been improved by dumping it into a vat of molten steel. Number 71, Knight Rider the Game 2, 27.6%. You might be wondering what possessed developer and publisher Davalex Games to adapt an almost 2-decade-old TV series into a game for the PlayStation 2, and honestly, we're wondering the exact same thing. As you may be able to glean from the title, Knight Rider the Game 2 was actually a sequel to Knight Rider the Game, which also wasn't very good, though it did scrape a review score of 40.89%, therefore making it just mediocre enough to not land a spot on this list. Knight Rider the Game 2, like the TV show and Knight Rider the Game 1, starred Michael Knight, a man who utilised the highly advanced car called KITT to help him fight crime. Players were expected to drive KITT around a number of levels, in order to scan some things and shoot others, so that they could get to the bottom of the appearance of some unusual black marks. Ooh, spooky. Admittedly, Knight Rider the Game 2 was a budget title, so expectations were already low, but even so, it still, somehow, managed to disappoint even the most avid of Knight Rider fans. The levels were poorly designed, the story was badly written, and the voice acting was just atrocious. As though all of that weren't bad enough, it didn't even have David Hasselhoff in it. What's the point of anything if it doesn't have the Hoff?
Number 70, ESPN NBA Tonight, 27.56%. These days, Konami are arguably more famous for their pachinko machines and their messy breakup with Hideo Kojima than they are for creating decent video games, but it hasn't always been that way. Hell, around the turn of the millennium, the company was famous for the likes of the Metal Gear, Silent Hill, and Castlevania series, all of which have entries that are considered to be amongst the best games ever made, and so it's somewhat shocking that they allowed tripe like ESPN NBA Tonight to be released at all. Like most other basketball titles, the idea behind ESPN NBA Tonight was to control little digital players and have them shoot hoops to score points. If NBA 2K1 was the benchmark for success in the virtual court at the time, then ESPN NBA Tonight was a masterclass on what not to do. Critics absolutely lambasted the game and levied complaints at everything from its graphics to its gameplay. The animations were wonky, the character models were ugly, and it controlled more poorly than a 3-wheeled, rock-filled shopping trolley. Considering that there were so many better basketball titles available in the year 2000, there was no reason for anyone to play this abomination. Put simply, ESPN NBA Tonight was the video game equivalent of asking your mum for McDonald's and being told that there's food at home, only to find out that said food at home is a mouldy Pop-Tart. Number 69. Nice! The Incredible Maze, 27.43%. It saddens us that such a banal game is taking up the nicest spot on this list, but I suppose that's just how the worst game's cookies crumble. The Incredible Maze was a WiiWare title that challenged players to roll a ball around a number of different mazes, with the overall aim being to make it to the end of the maze without falling victim to one of its many obstacles. The game could be controlled by either the Wiimote or the Wii Balance Board, so players could choose to do things with their hands or get their whole body involved. There were a number of issues with the Incredible Maze. Firstly, there's only so long that its premise remained entertaining, so whilst players may have had some fun trying to guide a little ball around a labyrinth at first, this soon becomes rather dull. The game was also a complete nightmare to control. The motion controls for both the Wiimote and the balance board were implemented horribly, meaning that players found it basically impossible to send the ball in the direction they wanted it to go. The Wiimote made the game marginally easier to control, but that was less to do with any sort of competence and more to do with the fact that it's easier to move your hands about than it is your whole body. Number 68. MTV's Celebrity Deathmatch, 27.42%. If you think the idea of pitting celebrities against each other in the wrestling ring sounds like a fun time, then it's clear that you've never played MTV's Celebrity Deathmatch. The game was based on the TV show of the same name and saw a bunch of celebrities, though that term is being used very loosely, duking it out in the wrestling ring. Players simply needed to hit their opponents until their life meter depleted, at which point they could finish them off with a special move. MTV's Celebrity Deathmatch was supposed to be comical, but all audiences ended up with was a game that was laughably bad. For one thing, the TV show's trademark humour was entirely missing from the game, replaced with a handful of repeated lines of dialogue that soon became grating. The matches against the computer were also insultingly easy, with many players finding that they were able to button mash their way to victory in under a minute. The graphics weren't up to much either, as the devs opted for standard character models rather than the claymation style that the show was known for. With more relevant celebrities, better writing, and graphics more reminiscent of the TV show, MTV's Celebrity Deathmatch might have been a bit of mindless fun, but as it was, players would have had a much better time if the actual game had been made out of Play-Doh. At least they could have smushed it up and turned it into something more interesting. Number 67. The Quiet Man, 27.15%. In 2018, the movie A Quiet Place was released and proved to audiences that it was possible to tell a successful story whilst keeping dialogue and sound to a minimum. Then, later that year, The Quiet Man was released and proved that whilst a low-dialogue, well-told story is possible, it takes some serious skill to pull off, and the team behind the game was clearly lacking it. The vast majority of The Quiet Man plays out in FMV segments, with some computer graphics sprinkled in here and there. The game tells the story of a young deaf man named Dane, whose dark past catches up to him when the plague doctor-like figure he created as a child begins kidnapping his friends. Upon its release, The Quiet Man was critically panned, with most reviewers agreeing that it failed to live up to the potential of its premise. Due to the fact that the game played out from Dane's point of view, players found that they struggled to make sense of the plot, as the lack of sound wasn't replaced with any other meaningful storytelling mechanic. Some outlets did praise the FMV cutscenes, but sadly they weren't enough to save the game from its other faults, which included lackluster button-mashing combat, camera issues, and low-quality graphics. Number 66. Basement Crawl, 27%. We've seen some fairly blatant rip-offs in our time here at Team TripleJump, but few have been as obvious as 2014's Basement Crawl, a title that was mechanically identical to the Bomberman series, but that didn't come with any of the charm. The game, which was released as a PlayStation 4 exclusive, lucky them, was entirely maze-based, and it was up to players to set traps to injure their opponents. The developers focused heavily on multiplayer, so although a single-player experience was available, Basement Crawl was allegedly better when played with friends. We can't imagine that they'd still have been your friends after you inflicted the game upon them, though. Some publications did praise Basement Crawl's gameplay mechanics, but considering that they had just been ripped off from another franchise, this wasn't really a win for the game. Mostly, it caught criticism for its lack of content and uninspired level design, as well as the plethora of bugs and glitches. Critics also leveled complaints at Basement Crawl's online matchmaking, or rather lack thereof, as rather than placing players into an appropriate game, they were left to choose from a list of matches. Suffice it to say that this was one game that should have crawled back under the rock whence it came. Yeah? You get it? Number 65. Looney Tunes Acme Arsenal, 27%. There were some games in the mid to late 2000s that released on Sony and Microsoft systems to a decent response from critics but had trouble sticking the landing when they came to Nintendo machines. Then there were others like Looney Tunes Acme Arsenal, which were utterly dreadful no matter which platform you played them on. Consistency, you love to see it. Admittedly, the Wii version of Acme Arsenal was the worst of the bunch, but the PS2 and Xbox 360 editions only scored 38 and 40 respectively, so they didn't exactly have much to crow about either. The game starred several beloved characters from Warner Bros. Looney Tunes cartoons, including Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and Taz the Tasmanian Devil, and tasked players with fighting, platforming, and puzzle-solving their way through a variety of levels. Had any real care been taken by the developers, then Acme Arsenal could have been a bit of wacky fun, especially for the kiddos, but it ended up being nothing more than a lazy attempt to cash in on a much-beloved franchise. The game was dull, repetitive, and filled to the brim with bugs, glitches, and control issues. Perhaps its worst sin, though, was the fact that it had none of Looney Tunes' trademark humor and traded in witty character interactions for uninspired one-liners that became less and less funny every time players heard them. Our recommendation? Drop an anvil on this thing and be done with it. Number 64. Godai Elemental Force, 27%. According to many folks, ourselves included, the PlayStation 2 was the greatest console of all time, and that was thanks in large part to the plethora of outstanding exclusives available for the platform. Godai Elemental Force was not one of them. Released in 2002, Godai Elemental Force told the story of a young man called Hero, whose name was in no way on the nose, as he attempted to master the elements of water, earth, wind, and fire, all whilst desperately trying to remember the 21st night of September. Fine, that last bit isn't true, but the rest is, I promise. Regrettably, the game was far from being a boogie wonderland, that's the last Earth, Wind and Fire joke in this entry, I swear, and was instead about as much fun as the hangover one might experience the morning after a night in the disco. Critics derided Godai for its uninspired and uninteresting story, lackluster graphics, abysmal frame rate, and awful sound effects. Some critics were quite impressed by the game's music, though considering that the rest of the audio was horrible, most players probably didn't get to hear it as they'd lightly muted their TVs. Godai, more like Dead on Arrival, got 'em. Number 63. Rogue Warrior, 27%. It saddens us to drag the name of the late, great Richard Marcinko through the mud, but there is simply no getting around the fact that Rogue Warrior was an absolute pile of tosh. Although the game is named after Marcinko's 1992 autobiography, it bore absolutely no relation to it, nor did it have anything to do with any of the dozen or so fictional novels written by Marcinko. Instead, it focused on a mission to North Korea that saw Marcinko attempting to disrupt ballistic missile launchers. Despite being published by Bethesda Softworks, who can usually be counted on to bestow decent games upon the world, just don't bring up Fallout 76, Rogue Warrior was critically panned. For one thing, it was ridiculously short for a full-price title, and players were less than impressed by the fact that they'd shelled out tens of dollars for a game they could beat in just 2 hours. This might have been forgiven had the gameplay been good, but alas, it was not. The gunplay was sorely lacking as the hit detection was incredibly hit and miss, no pun intended, but this didn't matter half of the time anyway because the enemy AI was so dumb that foes barely reacted to the player. Oh, Richard, you deserved better than this. Number 62. Jumper Griffin Story, 26.75%. Do you remember the movie Jumper? No? I'm not really surprised. It was a subpar sci-fi action flick starring everyone's favourite moody teen Jedi, Hayden Christensen, as a bloke with the ability to teleport who is being hunted down by religious fanatics for reasons. It scored a pitiful 15% on Rotten Tomatoes, so I suppose technically its video game tie-in was almost twice as good, though that really isn't saying much. Rather than focusing on the exploits of Hayden Christensen's character as the film did, the video game turned its attention to Griffin, played by little Billy Elliot himself, Jamie Bell. It tells the story of Griffin's worldwide search for the people who killed his parents and sees him fighting his way through hordes of goons in order to reach the truth. Sadly, even those who liked the movie had a hard time recommending Griffin's story as it had very little to offer. All Griffin did was run about from room to room beating up endless identical enemies. The combat wasn't even particularly satisfying either, as most players found that the most effective way to mow down foes was by button mashing. Throw into the mix some poor graphics and a woefully short runtime and you've got yourself a game that should have just jumped straight into the bargain bin. Number 61. Chicken Shoot, 26.38%. If in 2007 you were looking for a game that did exactly what it said on the box, then I suppose you could have done worse than to treat yourself to a copy of Chicken Shoot. After all, the entire game consisted of nothing more than sticking it to some poultry, so in that sense, it was a winner. However, if you are after any sort of story, character development, or actual entertainment, then Chicken Shoot probably wasn't the game for you. The premise was fairly simple. Players pointed their Wiimote in the general direction of a chicken and then blasted it into oblivion. There were a few different locales in which to shoot said chickens, but aside from that, things didn't vary all that much. On a technical level, there was nothing really wrong with Chicken Shoot, but the fact was that it had nothing to offer beyond, shooting chickens. There was no story, no additional gameplay modes, and no quests, missions, or any real reason to play the damned thing at all. Perhaps the most galling thing about Chicken Shoot, though, was the fact that it cost 30 whole dollary-doos. For that money, you could have bought yourself a box of nuggets and a copy of Chicken Run on DVD, and not only had a far more enjoyable poultry-themed time, but also some clucking change to boot. Peter?
Number 60. The Mark, 26.25%. If you're a first-person shooter, as a lot of games are these days, then it isn't a huge deal if you don't have the most groundbreaking storyline. After all, many gamers are happy to just blast a few enemies into oblivion and give little thought to the plot, and so long as you nail everything besides the narrative, no one's gonna worry too much. Sadly, The Mark not only had a whiz-poor excuse for a story, but it also missed the mark. Get it, Mr. Mark? On pretty much everything else it tried to do as well. What narrative there is tells of a terrorist plot to unleash a nuclear missile on the good people of London, and it's up to US Marine Steve Fletcher and mercenary Austin Hawke to put a stop to it. However, for Fletcher, the whole thing is personal, as the terrorists have also taken his sister, and he's hell-bent on getting her back. Because, seeing 9 million people vaporized in an instant isn't good enough motivation to get involved, I suppose. Now, before we start really tearing into The Mark, it is worth bearing in mind that it was a budget title, which does help us to forgive some of its sins, but not all. The plot was bland and boring, the characters were about as deep as a teaspoon, and the game suffered from numerous technical and gameplay issues to boot. The Mark was unbalanced, unfair, and didn't even have the decency to look nice whilst it was at it. Number 59. Druna Morbus Gravis, 26%. Oh yeah, here we go, Morbin time! Over the years, we've seen some real boob games on this channel, as in games that have completely embarrassed themselves. No! But Druna Morbus Gravis takes that descriptor to a whole new level, because of the other meaning of the word boob. The game was based on Paolo E. Serpieri's pornographic comic series Druna, which was published between 1985 and 2018. The plot of the game follows the titular hero, pun very much intended, as she attempts to uncover memories that will allow her to awaken from a coma. By using a device called the Brain Container, players moved around Druna's synapses, entered her memories, and solved puzzles. Premise-wise, it's not the worst we've ever heard of, it's just a shame that the execution was totally bungled. The game suffered from all of the usual symptoms of rubbish game syndrome, i.e. low-quality graphics, poor controls, and awful sound, but it was made even worse by the fact that it was so gosh darned hard, and not in a fun Dark Souls kind of way. If at any point during the game Druna got too stressed, or if the player saved too often, her psyche fractured beyond repair, basically meaning it was game over. Still, at least this prevented players from having to play the game any further, which really was a blessing in disguise. Number 58. Road Rage, 26%. In 1991, a vehicular combat game called Road Rash was released for the Sega Genesis and was met with critical acclaim. A string of respectable sequels followed in the years after, but the series hasn't been seen or heard from since 2009, leaving something of a gap in the alliterative motorcycle violence video game market, a gap that 2017's Road Rage didn't even come close to filling, despite its best efforts. Road Rage is set in the future, one where motorcycle gangs ride about the place and whack each other with big sticks. This could have been a bit of mindless fun, but shoddy execution just left players with well, with road rage. The game's main problem was its core mechanic, which isn't a great start, is it? Most critics found the driving to be absolutely painful, as the bikes themselves handled approximately as well as the Little Tykes Cozy Coupe, if not worse, take it from me. Things were no better on a technical level either, as road rage suffered from some seriously wonky physics. 1 minute, players would collide with a car head-on and suffer no more than a slight inconvenience, and the next, they'd roll over a loose pebble and find themselves yeeted into the next millennium. To top it all off, road rage didn't even look or sound nice, leaving players with a game that was more upsetting than being stuck in rush hour traffic. Number 57. Mucha Lucha Mascaritas of the Lost Code, 26%. Here's a little known fact for you. TripleJump Towers isn't just home to all the wonderful folks of Team TripleJump. After all, we only have about 10 members of staff, and so, being the business wizards and kind people that we are, we decided to rent a couple of floors of our ginormous skyscraper to the lads and lasses from wrestling channel Cultaholic. Am I saying that right?
Little dweeb!
Naturally, being in such close proximity to so many spandex-clad ladies and gents means that we've come to rather enjoy the wrestles ourselves. And so it now pains us all the more to see not only a bad video game, but a bad wrestling-themed video game. Based on Mucha Lucha, the kids' TV series from the early 2000s, Mucha Lucha Mascaritas of the Lost Code follows 3 masked Mexican wrestlers as they try to retrieve the Code of Masked Wrestling, an artifact that's been stolen from their school. Fail to get it back, and they'll be expelled, a punishment which seems wholly unfair, but there you go. Questionable education practices weren't the only thing wrong with Mascaritas of the Lost Code, though, and the game failed at basically everything it attempted. The whole thing looked horrible, the animation was juddery, and each level consisted of nothing more than a never-ending cavalcade of goons that required little effort to defeat. Admittedly, the difficulty was ramped up by some seriously bad collision detection, but that's not exactly the challenge that most players were looking for. Number 56. Stake Fortune Fighters, 26%. We're sticking with horrid 2003 fighting titles for the moment as we turn our attention to Stake Fortune Fighters, a game that proved incredibly unfortunate for those unlucky enough to shell out money for the darn thing. Premise-wise, Stake Fortune Fighters has nothing to do with sirloin or rump or perhaps fillet cuts of beef, and is instead centered on a tournament in which elite combatants fight each other for money, fame, and respect. Where are my meat products? Players chose from one of several generic-looking characters, and then got to button mashing their way through a number of foes. The first issue with Stake Fortune Fighters was the sheer size of the levels. Players found that they spent much of their time just wandering these poorly designed environments looking for someone to fight, though when they did find an opponent, things didn't get much better. The fights themselves required no strategy beyond just hitting buttons at random, and brought absolutely nothing new to the table in terms of gameplay mechanics. All of the usual suspects were there, i.e. combos, special moves, and power-ups, but none of it felt particularly competent. The game did come with a multiplayer mode, though this was hampered again by the level size, which meant the whole thing had to be split screen. Well, I say the whole thing had to be split screen. The developers could have just brought everything together when players got close to one another, but no, they opted to keep things split throughout, which was just the tip of Stake Fortune Fighters' dumb design iceberg. Number 55. HBO Boxing, 26%. If you saw the words HBO Boxing just now and thought to yourself, oh, exciting, I can finally see who'd win in a fistfight between Tony Soprano and Carrie Bradshaw, then you're about to be in for some severe disappointment. Alas, HBO Boxing was not a game that pitted fictional characters from popular HBO shows against one another, but was rather a sports title that featured the boxers whose licenses other developers hadn't already gotten their grubby mitts on by the year 2000. The first of many problems with HBO Boxing was the fact that it looked just horrible, even for a game released in 2000. All of the boxers, despite being based on real human people, looked very generic and moved in a slow, unnatural, and somewhat unsettling way. It was almost as though whoever programmed them had never experienced movement for themselves and had to base the animations on third-party accounts of what it was like to throw a punch. Things didn't get much better when it came to the actual gameplay, which was, again, slow. This was thanks in large part to the control scheme, which required entirely too much thought on the part of the player for a sport that's supposed to be instinctive. Put it this way, you'd have probably gotten a lot more enjoyment out of a George Foreman grill than you would this utter mess. Ooh, look at all the fat draining off that burger. So much healthier. Number 54, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, 26%. There are some out there who believe that Johnny Depp's performance as Willy Wonka was the greatest ever insult to the good name of Roald Dahl, and Gene Wilder too for that matter, but the actor's unsettling appearance in the role was downright brilliant in comparison to the movie's video game tie-in. The game centres on the eponymous Charlie, and more or less follows the plot of the film. Players start out by chasing money so that Charlie can buy a Wonka bar and get his golden ticket, before heading to the chocolate factory itself and dealing with the problems left behind by the other children on the tour. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the video game, didn't exactly wow critics on any platform, garnering review scores between 35 and 39 on console, but it was on the PC where it disappointed the most. There was some praise for the voice acting, which was provided by the cast of the movie, save for Johnny Depp, who presumably took one look at the project and decided his reputation couldn't take the hit. Critics were also quite nice about the pleasantly designed environments and colourful art style, but that's really where the compliments ended. The controls were wonky, no pun intended, the camera was awkward, and the whole thing was full of bugs, which in a food preparation area is a serious health code violation. Number 53, R.I.P.D. The Game, 26%. We're sticking with the movie theme for the time being as we take a look at R.I.P.D. The Game, a title that was, according to critics at least, slightly better than the film it was based on, a rare treat. R.I.P.D. The Game had the same basic premise as R.I.P.D. The Movie. Certain souls are recruited into the Rest in Peace department after they die, and are charged with capturing deados, i.e. those who have died but managed to escape judgment. Unlike most movie tie-in games though, R.I.P.D. opted not to follow the plot of the film, or even tell a prequel or sequel tale, but instead went down the narrative-less cooperative shooter route. Each of the 7 levels consisted of 5 rounds of increasing difficulty, during which the player would be tasked with fighting off waves of deados, and that's it. Critics complained that the levels were bland, and regardless of whether you were fighting deados in the meth lab, subway, or public library, they were all boxy, beige, and uninspired. The game also failed to give players any sense of progression, and it wasn't even clear during the actual matches whether or not they were winning. They just had to keep blasting and hope for the best. That was, of course, if they could find a match in the first place, thanks to a combination of dodgy matchmaking and people just not wanting to play this game, full stop. Number 52, Kiss Pinball, 26%. If we were to ask you what things you most associate with glam rockers Kiss, you'd probably say things like makeup, weirdest games ever, crazy, 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 crazy nights, and venereal disease. In fact, we imagine you'd have to list off a lot of things before you finally got to pinball. Clearly though, someone down at Kiss HQ thought there would be some serious overlap in the people who love Kiss versus people who love pinball Venn diagram, which is presumably why Kiss Pinball ended up being a thing. The premise of Kiss Pinball was quite straightforward. In fact, it was pretty much identical to regular pinball, just with Kiss theming. Players launched a small metal ball into the playing area and then used the flippers at the bottom of the table to hit targets. The game boasted a whopping 2 tables, each of which came emblazoned with the faces of Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Peter Criss, and Ace Frehley, and blasted generic-sounding guitar riffs that we aren't even convinced were by Kiss. Surely they could have easily got the license for the music here. On PC, the game scored a passable 61 out of 100, but on PlayStation, it took a critical battering. Aside from the lack of table choice and pants music, critics complained about the camera, slowdowns, and wonky physics. Admittedly, the game only cost $10, but if you were a Kiss fan, there were far better ways to spend that money. Perhaps on a CD of their actual music? Just throwing that out there, you know? Number 51, Tenkai Knights Brave Battle, 26%. If you were an anime fan from America, Canada, or Japan in 2013 and 14, then it's possible you've enjoyed an episode or two of Tenkai Knights. The show focused on 4 teens who discover a portal to another world and end up getting dragged into its civil war. Honestly, if I had a quid for every time that's happened to me. Tenkai Knights Brave Battle was a tie-in video game for the Nintendo 3DS and followed much the same premise as the show. Protagonists Gurren, Seilan, Toxa, and Chuki fall through an interdimensional portal, assume the roles of the legendary Tenkai Knights, because they're certainly qualified, and fight to protect both planet Quarton and Earth from evil. With a developer that truly cared about the franchise at the helm, the game could have been great, but what players got was a lazy, uninspired release that just screamed cash grab. To be clear, Tenkai Knights Brave Battle wasn't broken, it just wasn't all that exciting. The levels all consisted of the same thing over and over again, i.e. kill robots, get rewards, move on to next stage. The controls were clunky, and the mechanics were poorly explained, leaving players to figure out what the hell they were supposed to be doing through trial and error. Tenkai Knights? More like 1 out of 10 Kai Knights. Well, it got 26%, so more like 2.6 out of 10 Kai Knights. Yeah, can someone take over, please?
Number 50, Jenga World Tour, 26%. There are some tabletop games out there that benefited from making the leap to our consoles. Take Monopoly, for example. No more stupid denominations of money to count, no more metal tokens with sharp corners that get stuck in your feet, and absolutely no more flipping the board when you're losing. Then there are some games, like Jenga, that should be left well alone. If you're unfamiliar with the tabletop version of Jenga, the premise is thus. 2 players start with a tower made from wooden blocks, and they must take turns removing 1 block at a time and then placing it back on top. The loser is the player who removes the block that topples the tower. It's simple and straightforward and definitely does not need to be digitalised. Jenga World Tour had the same basic premise, only with some incredibly wonky physics and controls. Not only was Jenga World Tour several times the price of its tabletop counterpart, but it was also fundamentally broken. The Wiimote made it incredibly difficult to remove the blocks, so 9 times out of 10, players found that they'd end up grabbing the wrong piece and bringing the whole tower down. Sure, the game came with some interesting environments, but that still didn't make it worth the price, or make up for the fact that it didn't work properly. If you look up the word useless in the dictionary, you'll find a picture of Jenga World Tour. Number 49, World War II Combat Iwo Jima, 26%. War! What is it good for? Inspiring horrible video games like World War II Combat Iwo Jima, apparently. World War II Combat Iwo Jima was not the first game in the World War II Combat series, having been preceded by World War II Combat Road to Berlin a few months prior, but it was, according to its review score at least, the better of the two. Sadly, we won't be seeing Road to Berlin on this list, as it wasn't reviewed by enough publications to hit our criteria. As the name might suggest, World War II Combat Iwo Jima was set during the Second World War, and for the most part, players undertook combat missions on the Japanese island of Iwo Jima. The game was, admittedly, a budget title, though it clearly had lofty ambitions and hoped to measure up to the likes of the Call of Duty series, which is probably part of the reason that it was judged so harshly. Everything the game tried to do had been done better elsewhere. The graphics looked awful, the AI was wonky, and the checkpoint system was downright diabolical. Sure, you might have saved yourself a few quid by picking up a copy of Iwo Jima rather than waiting a couple of months and spending a few extra pennies on Call of Duty 3, but it would have come at the expense of your sanity. Number 48, Survivor, the interactive game, 25.88%. The TV show Survivor has been running in the United States since the year 2000 and sees a bunch of contestants dumped in an isolated location and forced to fend for themselves. Each episode, someone will be eliminated, and ultimately whoever ends up being the sole survivor gets bragging rights and a cool $1 million. It probably isn't everyone's cup of tea, but it's fairly enjoyable if you like reality telly. Alas, the same cannot be said of the show's 2001 video game tie-in. As was the case in the TV show, Survivor, the interactive game, tasked players with surviving using only what Bear Grylls-esque skills they happened to possess. Players not only needed to ensure they had enough food and water, but also that they were nice and pally with other inhabitants, or face being voted off. Although Survivor the TV show had a lot going for it, none of its charm was retained by its video game tie-in. The game was tedious, dull and repetitive, though many players didn't get to experience much of it, as Survivor would repeatedly crash. The game was so bad, in fact, that Game Revolution created an interactive review, which allowed readers to choose comments from drop-down menus, and was infinitely more fun than Survivor itself. Number 47, Raven's Cry, 25.71%. You know what we love here at Team TripleJump? Pirates! You know what we don't love? Games that sully the good name of our favourite rum-drinking scallywags by being offensive to just about every minority group they can think of. Yes, I'm talking to you, Raven's Cry. Stop hiding behind that big hat. The plot of the game focuses on Christopher Raven, a man whose family was massacred by pirates when he was a boy, and who now seeks vengeance against the men responsible. Raven's Cry was absolutely awful from start to finish, and it's actually a miracle that it managed to scrape as high of a review score as it did. Large swathes of the dialogue were missing, and the game was brimming with technical issues, which led critics to believe that it was released unfinished. Even when Raven's Cry worked, things didn't get much better for players. The gameplay was dull, the controls were clunky, the plot was somehow both derivative and yet convoluted at the same time, and the voice acting was just atrocious. As though that weren't bad enough, the game's writing was racist, sexist, and homophobic, which leads us to suspect that Raven's Cry was not, in fact, a video game, but a social experiment to see just how many people you could piss off in the space of a few short hours. Number 46, Wiffle Ball, 25.64%. We come now to another game that was both more useless and less fun than its real-world counterpart. For our non-American viewers, wiffle ball is a variation of baseball, which is designed to be played in a more confined space, like a gymnasium or a garden. It's played with a much lighter bat and ball, and, from what we can gather, is a sport favoured by children. Wiffle ball, for the Nintendo DS, took this concept and made it worse in pretty much every way. Now, we won't pretend to be experts on wiffle ball, but according to several reviewers, the first issue with Wiffle Ball the video game was that the rules made no sense. There was also no way to adjust the batter's swing, despite the fact that the pitcher would often throw high or low, so players often found they'd miss the ball through no fault of their own. Pitching fared no better either, because despite there being several throwing options, the AI batter would hit the ball no matter what. Wiffle Ball also suffered from horrible-looking graphics, irritating music and sound effects, and unresponsive controls. If you were the world's biggest fan of the sport, and Wiffle Ball the video game was the only way you'd ever get to experience it, then no, not even then. No Wiffle Ball is better than this Wiffle Ball. Number 45, Deca Sports Freedom, 25.2%. We're sticking with the theme of crappy sports titles for the moment, as we shine a spotlight on Deca Sports Freedom, the fifth entry in the Deca Sports franchise, and if you're unfamiliar with the series, we can't say we're surprised. The original Deca Sports, or Sports Island if you want to get European about this, was released in 2008. It reviewed horribly, but sold well, and so a cavalcade of sequels followed. Wii owners were spared the pain of Deca Sports Freedom though, as the game was released as an Xbox 360 exclusive. Using the Kinect, players could take part in 10 different sports, including tennis, boxing, archery, and dodgeball. And there are absolutely no prizes for guessing that each of these minigames controlled horribly. Sadly, the fact you had to control Deca Sports Freedom using the Kinect was its main draw, and since that didn't work properly, there was really nothing that critics could find to love about the game. It ended up getting compared unfavourably to Kinect Sports, a game that, whilst not perfect, at least did what it was supposed to do, most of the time. Deca Sports Freedom, on the other hand, was a broken mess of a game without a single original idea. Number 44, Peter Jackson's King Kong, the official game of the movie, 25.14%. We're heading back to bad movie tie-in land now, as we look at Peter Jackson's King Kong, the original game of the movie. A game that actually wasn't terrible on most platforms. The PS2, Xbox, Xbox 360 and GameCube versions of the game all managed to attain review scores in the low 80s. So where did it all go wrong for the Nintendo DS? Regardless of whether you were playing one of the good versions or the crappy DS edition of King Kong, the premise was much the same. Across multiple levels, players took on the role of either Jack Driscoll, regular-sized human man, or King Kong, very large not human man, and did their darndest to fend off the many hostile beasties of Skull Island. On home consoles, King Kong was a competent action-adventure title, but on the DS, it was a steaming pile of monkey plops. The graphics were laughably poor, and whilst the Nintendo DS wasn't exactly famed for its cutting-edge audio-visual capabilities, what was on offer in King Kong was completely unforgivable. Critics also lambasted the gameplay, which was mind-numbingly dumb and repetitive, and the lack of action that was on offer. In a title where you play as King Kong, you'd expect to do a little bit of rampaging, and admittedly, many players probably did end up smashing things, though they would have been their own personal belongings as they tried to air their frustration at this game. Number 43, Aquaman Battle for Atlantis, 25.1%. I don't think it's unfair to say that Aquaman isn't exactly the most popular superhero of all time. With that said though, he has his fans, and certainly didn't deserve the treatment he was given by 2003's Aquaman Battle for Atlantis, a game that was about as much fun as getting water stuck in your ears. In terms of premise, Aquaman Battle for Atlantis revolves around the eponymous water-dwelling hero's attempts to prevent his mortal enemy Black Manta from destroying the city of Atlantis. The first major problem with Battle for Atlantis was the fact that the whole game was a load of back-to-back water levels, and as we all know, water levels are the devil's work. Even if you're a fan of water levels, you probably wouldn't have enjoyed this game, as each stage was a bland, fog-filled snooze fest with nothing more to do than just beat up a handful of copy-paste enemies. For a game set in the deep ocean, it was horrendously shallow. The graphics were nothing to write home about either, and the usually ruggedly handsome Aquaman ended up looking more like Dog the Bounty Hunter. Admittedly, Aquaman Battle for Atlantis was a budget title, so no one was expecting much in the first place, but even so, the whole thing was an affront to the DC universe, and players would have been better spending their $20 on literally anything else. Perhaps a Dog the Bounty Hunter box set. Number 42, Game Party, 25%. If you cast your mind all the way back to entry number 93 on this list, you'll remember us talking about just how terrible Game Party 2 was. Alas, that wasn't even close to being the low point in the series, as proved by 2007's Game Party, and another entry on this list that is yet to come. Although the original Game Party wasn't the worst Game Party title from a critical standpoint, it could be argued that it was the most egregious offender for having the audacity to kick off such a repugnant franchise. The title was made up of a bunch of mini-games, all of which were controlled by wiggling the Wiimote in the general direction of the screen. Said games included darts, table hockey, and a trivia quiz, though as you can probably imagine, they were all just awful. Critics found the motion controls were poorly implemented for most of the mini-games, making activities that would be fun at your local arcade utterly frustrating. The one game that didn't require much in the way of controlling, the trivia quiz, was also disappointing as the questions weren't localised, so most British players found themselves stumped by questions about American football. However, Game Party's biggest sin was that it was simply no fun to play, even if you could get the controls to work. And we imagine that if you were to take it to a party, they'd ask you to leave immediately. Number 41, Amy, 25%. We've seen some incredibly poor horror games here at Team TripleJump. Heck, we've even covered a couple on this list, but few hold a candle to the sheer abhorrence that was 2012's Amy. The game's story focuses on Lana, who the player controls, and Amy, a child with autism and superpowers, as the duo attempts to flee a city that's been overrun with zombies. As sidekicks go, Amy is pretty useless, but her one saving grace is the fact that she's able to heal Lana when her blood-to-lurgy ratio starts to tip in favour of the lurg. This is great and all, but it does mean that players can never venture too far from Amy, so just stuffing her in a cupboard while you do something else is completely out of the question. The irritating escort mission nature of this game certainly was a problem, but in comparison to Amy's other issues, it really was just the tip of the iceberg. You name it, Amy did it wrong. Its graphics were low quality and glitchy, the camera was awkward, the stealth mechanics didn't work properly, the gameplay was repetitive, and the voice acting was just awful.
This place stinks of that pesty infection.
If you consider titles like Resident Evil and Silent Hill to be the pinnacle of horror gaming, then Amy is the funny-smelling gunk scraped from the bottom of the barrel.
Number 40. Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22. 25%. We're not really sure what Dragon Ball Z did to deserve such awful treatment in the world of video games, but this is the second appearance of the franchise on this list, so we can only assume it was something truly dire. The story of Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22's release is a bit of an odd one. The game was originally released in Japan and Europe in 1995 and 1996 respectively, but it didn't make its way to North America until 2003. However, by that point, the 6th generation was in full swing, and so when compared to PlayStation 2 releases, well, let's just say that Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22 didn't exactly fare very well. The game was a straightforward fighter starring characters from the Dragon Ball Z universe. Players would go one-on-one against either the computer or a friend, and the winner was the first one to deplete their opponent's health bar. Although some outlets praised the game's roster of fighters, which consisted of 27 playable characters, there weren't very many more positive things they could find to say. For reasons unknown, though presumably to speed up release, no English dub was produced for the game, and all of the cutscenes were removed, so the game had no story. The gameplay was also painfully slow when compared to other fighters of the time, the controls were clunky, and the visuals just weren't up to snuff. Number 39. eFootball 2022. 25%. We come now to a game that is not only completely pants, but that also proves that the games industry has learned absolutely nothing from decades of plops releases. You'd think by now that developers would know what not to do, but it turns out that you would be wrong. Now admittedly, eFootball 2022 is a title that's free to play, but there are some that would argue that even that price is far too high. Like the PES series before it, eFootball 2022 sees players taking control of little digital versions of their favourite footballers and passing, dribbling and kicking balls in order to score goals. The difference between eFootball 2022 and its PES predecessors could not have been more apparent to players who booted the game up to find that something had gone very, very wrong down at Konami HQ. The graphics were laughably bad, and images of a stunned-looking Messi and giant-mouthed Ronaldo soon made the rounds. Players probably could have gotten over the hilarity of the character models had eFootball 2022 functioned properly, but sadly for them, it did not. The game was sorely lacking in content, the controls were finicky, and you couldn't move for bugs and glitches. We'd love to relegate this one to the bargain bin, but considering that it's already free, the only thing Konami could possibly do to shift copies is to pay people to play it. They won't though, they're too busy with their darned pachinko machines. Number 38. Call for Heroes Pompolic Wars. 25%. If done well, the classic dungeon crawler can be a whole lot of fun. There's just something really satisfying about wandering up to a pack of enemies and mincing them like they're not even there. If the fundamentals aren't there though, i.e. competent combat, level design and controls, then you're going to be in for a rough old time. Clearly, the team behind Call for Heroes Pompolic Wars failed to invest in a copy of Dungeon Crawlers for Dummies because they didn't even bother to include anything that might have made their 2007 title a half-decent game. Players started out by picking from one of two heroes, either a warrior or an Amazon, depending on whether they chose to be male or female. From there, they went out into the world to match some creepy skeletons, though for what reason the game never really clarified. According to the back of the box, a rift has opened, and so players must fend off the evil Pompolic and the demonic forces that seek to enslave the human race. Oh, and there's something about Dark Souls, although we don't think this has anything to do with From Software. The game was a complete shambles from start to finish. The controls and combat were janky as heck, the level design was confusing, the narrative was basically non-existent, and to top it all off, the game was riddled with bugs. Number 37. Cruisin'. 25%. Oh, look everyone, it's a game that thinks that dropping letters from its name and replacing them with apostrophes makes it look cool. You don't look cool, Cruisin', you look downright daft. The Cruisin' series has actually been around since the mid-90s, but not one of the games has been what you'd call good. In fact, of the first 4 titles in the franchise, only one has an average review score above 60%. Even by the series standards though, the 2007 Wii exclusive Cruisin' was a very poor showing indeed. In terms of its premise, Cruisin' was much like other racing titles. Players competed in races in order to earn themselves some dollary dues, and those could be spent on purchasing upgrades for their car. However, as we all know, if you're going to do something simple and straightforward, you need to be able to do it well, and to call Cruisin' incompetent would be a massive understatement. understatement. Being a title for the Wii, players were forced to steer cars with the Wiimote, which was fine when it was functioning properly, but unfortunately the Wiimote was, at best, an unpredictable beast. The graphics also didn't look like they'd had much of an update since the original cruising title came out in 1994, and the whole thing was marred by technical problems. Talk about a game that's cruising for a bruisin'. Am I right? Number 36. Lula 3D, 24.6%. When a game's primary selling point is the fact that it comes with bouncing boobs technology, you know you're gonna be in for a terrible time. Now don't get us wrong, we're all for bouncing boobs, but a game needs to back them up with, well, literally anything else, otherwise what's the point? Alright, in fairness to Lula 3D, it did have a plot in addition to the bouncing boobs. It wasn't a very good plot, but still. The game follows Lula, a pornographic actress who is forced to delay the shooting of her next feature when 3 of her co-stars go missing. For reasons best known to herself, Lula decides to try and track them down rather than, call the police. Shockingly, Lula 3D did not fare well with critics who complained about the childish way in which the game handled its subject matter. The title also suffered from all of the standard symptoms of bad game syndrome, including poor controls, tedious gameplay, subpar sound design, and a plethora of bugs and glitches. Some publications did argue that it fell into the so bad it's good category of terrible video games, but it's worth remembering that at its core, Lula 3D was just awful. Number 35. Batman Dark Tomorrow, 24.06%. Well, if it isn't the second worst Batman video game ever made. What? You might be thinking to yourself. With an average review score of only 24.06%, surely things can't get any worse for The Dark Knight? Stick a pin in that, dear viewer. We'll come back to it in a bit. Still, even though Batman Dark Tomorrow wasn't the worst of the Bat Bunch, it was still a very poor showing for old Brucey Dubs. Released in 2003 for Xbox and GameCube, Batman Dark Tomorrow sees the eponymous Caped Crusader facing off against Ra's al Ghul, or Ra's al Ghul, depending on how you want to pronounce it, who, in a bid to take over the world, has taken control of a weaponized satellite. Gameplay-wise, players got stealth-based action with a linear story, though there were multiple endings that could be obtained dependent on the player's actions. As we've said though, the game was total crap, and we'd be hugely surprised if anyone has played it through enough times to see all of the endings. The actual premise of the game wasn't half bad, and even critics went as far as to praise Batman Dark Tomorrow's storyline and cutscenes. Sadly, they were about the only half-decent thing that the game had to offer, and as such it received a critical bataranging. Critics complained of wonky controls, dull and repetitive missions, and a frustrating camera, not to mention the veritable smorgasbord of bugs and glitches that plagued the title. Number 34. Hooters Road Trip, 24%. They say that the sexy stuff sells, which is probably why the Hooters chain of restaurants is so successful. Well, that and the fact that their chicken wings are absolutely banging, so we're told. Sadly, it seems that not everything attached to the Hooters brand is fun, as evidenced by 2002's Hooters Road Trip, a racing title that was lacking in both the racing and Hooters departments. The game gave players the opportunity, if you call it that, to race all around the United States, and as they did so, they got to unlock additional cars. If you're thinking that doesn't sound like a premise that has much to do with attractive waitresses and/or delicious meaty treats, then you're totally correct. The actual racing segment of the game had absolutely nothing to do with Hooters. That requirement was fulfilled with cringeworthy FMV segments sprinkled in between each stage. So what did Hooters Road Trip do well? The box art was quite cool, I suppose. Oh, who am I kidding? The game was a complete waste of time. The gameplay was dull and repetitive, the controls were sorely lacking, and the graphics were, if you'll pardon my French, absolutely rubbish. The game was part of Ubisoft's value line, so it would have only set players back about $10. With that said, you could have taken that $10 to an actual Hooters, ordered yourself some wings, and had a much better time in the process. Number 33. NBA Unrivaled, 24%. Yeah, sports time, something about giving this everything I've got, you know the drill. Presumably, when Acronym Games came up with the moniker for their 2009 basketball title, they assumed that what the game would be unrivaled in was its gameplay, graphics, and how much fun it had to offer players. Well, it certainly was unrivaled in each and every one of those categories, though no points for guessing that it wasn't in a complimentary sense. NBA Unrivaled was basketball-themed and arcade-style, so players went 5-on-5 against either the computer or a friend to shoot as many hoops as possible. That is, if you could convince a friend to play it with you. The problems with NBA Unrivaled ran deep to the point where it was basically unplayable. The animations were so poor that players often found it difficult to keep up with the action on screen, and the AI rubber banding couldn't have been more obvious if the developers had tried. Yes, NBA Unrivaled was a budget title, but there were so many better things you could have spent $10 on that wouldn't have left you feeling complete and utter disappointment, like a bumper pack of actual rubber bands. They'd hold your things together, and you could have tons of fun pinging them at people. Still, at least NBA Unrivaled isn't the absolute worst sports video game ever made, so silver linings, I suppose. Number 32. Terror Wars New York Invasion, 24%. Have you ever thought about what you might do if hostile aliens invaded Earth? Personally, I'd probably just hide under my bed, and if the monsters came a-knocking, try to ply them with custard creams and hope for the best. I admit, my alien invasion survival plan is probably not the best. However, if you're anything like the protagonist of Terror Wars New York Invasion, medical student John Armstrong, you'd be out there on the front lines with the National Guard giving those aliens what for. Why would a medical student be part of the National Guard, I hear you ask? Don't worry about that. I'm sure the game clears it up at some point. What's that? It doesn't. Oh, well, just go with it, I suppose. Unfortunately, Terror Wars' slightly flimsy premise wasn't its only problem. In fact, the first-person shooter missed the mark on pretty much all fronts. The first issue was that the game was insultingly easy, so because ammo and health were handed out like candy, players never really felt like they were in any sort of danger. It was also hugely repetitive, and not just in terms of its mission objectives, with textures and NPC character models copied and pasted all over the game. This might not have been so much of a problem if the graphics were up to snuff, but unsurprisingly, they were incredibly lackluster. Ultimately, Terror Wars New York Invasion had nothing to offer players. Technically, it was playable, but oddly enough, players look for far more in a video game than just functionality. Number 31. Postal 3, 24%. Have you ever wondered where the phrase "going postal" actually comes from? Well, we've taken a quick trip down that rabbit hole and found out the phrase is derived from a string of incidents in the USA where postal workers shot and killed multiple people. As though the fact that the Postal franchise is named after a series of mass shootings isn't bad enough, they don't even have the common decency to be good games, and just because Postal 3 is the only title to make it onto this list, it doesn't follow that the rest of them are good. In fact, until Postal Brain Damaged was released in 2022, the games had never garnered average review scores higher than 59 out of 100. Postal 3 is without a doubt the worst of the bunch, because not only was it an affront to good taste, but it was also a poorly made, buggy mess of a game. Postal 3 sees players taking on the role of the postal dude who moves to the town of Catharsis after blowing up his old town with a nuclear bomb. Players may choose whether to take the good path, siding with law enforcement, or the bad path, joining in with the mayor's dastardly schemes. The game received a critical crucifixion, with reviewers complaining about everything from its poor writing to its technical flaws. Postal 3 was so bad, in fact, that even the developer regards it as a dodgy spin-off that should never have happened. They are not wrong.
Number 30. Game Party Champions, 24%. We promise you this is the last Game Party title that will appear on this list, and we thank you for sticking with us throughout them all. Not only was Game Party Champions the very worst of the Game Party bunch, but it was also released for one of the worst consoles that Nintendo have ever put their name to. Like its predecessors, Game Party Champions consisted of a number of mini-games based on sports and/or the sort of machines you'd find in an arcade. The title, boasting a whopping 8 mini-games, included mini-golf, air hockey, and baseball. Game Party Champions also took a stab at telling a story, though rather than pulling off a perfect assassination, it tripped on its shoelaces and pierced its own foot with the knife. Players take on the role of Riley, a young man who's berated for being lazy by his friend and coerced into entering a tournament at his local arcade. Oh, and they throw in a dead dad to give some explanation as to why Riley doesn't want to do anything. I'm not really sure why there was any need for that. The game was panned by every critic that had the misfortune to come into contact with it, and it was slated for its ugly graphics, wonky controls, and overall lack of fun. Ken Barnes of Nintendo Life even went as far as to say that Game Party Champions was, quote, so bad that your great-great-grandchildren will want to change their surname when they find out that you once played it. Ouch. Number 29. Legends of Wrestling 2, 24%. We understand that video games can be divisive at times. There may have even been an entry in this list so far that you actually secretly quite liked. Oh dear. But here's a statement I think I can make without being too controversial. Legends of Wrestling 2 for the Game Boy Advance was not very good. The original Legends of Wrestling, released on the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, wasn't a fantastic title, but it did sell well enough to merit a sequel. In addition to the handheld release, Legends of Wrestling 2 was also available on the aforementioned consoles, and whilst those versions weren't good by any stretch of the imagination, they were a darn sight better than the GBA edition. Now, to its credit, Legends of Wrestling 2 for the Game Boy Advance did have the full 40 wrestler roster, try saying that 10 times fast, but aside from that, it didn't really have all that much to offer. In comparison to the home console versions, the graphics were painfully bad. Each wrestler was horribly low-res, the animations were jerky, and the sprites would very often clip through each other. This made it difficult enough to tell what was going on when just 2 wrestlers were in the ring, and when more were added in, it was downright impossible. Throw into the mix some horrid collision detection, and you've got yourself a game that deserved to be suplexed straight into the nearest bin. Number 28, Pulse Racer, 24%. If the 2003 racing title Pulse Racer is to be believed, then as a society, we're just a couple of years away from motorsports in which drivers' lives are tied to their vehicles, and pushing themselves too hard will result in cardiac arrest. Considering just how the world seems to be doing at the moment, it wouldn't actually surprise me if that does indeed come to pass. Set in the distant future of 2024, Pulse Racer was a title that attempted to push the envelope by introducing a mechanic that would see racers suffering from a heart attack if players used too much speed boost. This was, I don't think it's unfair to say, a dumb idea, because if there's one thing that most players want from a racing title, it's the ability to go fast without worrying that their poor driver is going to keel over at the wheel. To its credit, Pulse Racer looked, sounded, and worked just fine, but its core concept was completely flawed, which made it absolutely not fun to play. On top of that, the single-player mode was unreasonably difficult, as the other drivers seemed not to be affected by the same cardiac troubles as the player character. So whilst your driver was waiting to be revived by a quick shot of adrenaline, everyone else would be zipping ahead and winning the race. If there's one thing to take away from Pulse Racer, it's that whilst innovation can be a great thing, not every new idea is a winner. Number 27, Miami Vice, 23.67%. We're not sure what happened in 2004 to make Davalex Games think that what gamers really wanted was crappy tie-ins to 80s TV shows, because this is the second time the studio has appeared on this list with such a title. We can only assume some sort of experimentation with hallucinogenic drugs or a blow to the head was involved. If you're unfamiliar with Miami Vice, and if you're under the age of about 45, that's highly likely and understandable, then allow me to fill you in on the show's premise. Originally airing between 1984 and 1990, this American crime drama starred Don Johnson and Philip Michael Thomas as a pair of undercover detectives working in Miami. If you were into police procedurals, it wasn't half bad. Miami Vice the game also stuck with this premise, only with one major difference. It was half bad. In fact, it was very bad. Across 14 missions, players stepped into the shoes of protagonists Cockett and Tubbs in order to take down drug dealers and ultimately dismantle the empire of drug lord Ortega. Critics generally agreed that had the game been released in the 90s, then it would have been an average, though not great, action title. By 2004, however, players had come to expect more from their video games, and everything about Miami Vice felt either outdated or poorly executed. In fact, most reviewers struggled to find anything nice to say about the game at all. The graphics were poor, the sound was grating, the AI was stupid, and the controls were infuriating. Like mullets, shoulder pads, and Jason Donovan, Miami Vice should have stayed in the 80s, where it belonged. Number 26, Gravity Games Bike Street Vert Dirt, 23.33%. If the quality of a video game directly correlated with the number of irrelevant words in its title, then Gravity Games Bike Street Vert Dirt probably would be the very best game in the entire world. Sadly, that's not how any of this works. 2002's Gravity Games Bike Obtuse Rubber Goose Green Moose Guava Juice was an extreme sports title akin to the likes of Dave Mirra Freestyle BMX, and saw players riding around on a tiny pedal bike and performing stunts and that in order to earn points. It featured riders such as Jamie Bestwick, Dennis McCoy, and Tim Fuzzy Hall. I assume if you're into BMXing, those names mean something to you. Had 10 different levels and came with a multiplayer mode. Not that anyone would have wanted to play it with you. Critics had a variety of complaints about the game, bemoaning its unresponsive controls, poor collision detection, and scores of bugs. Some outlets did praise the vast levels and wide variety of characters, but those things weren't enough to save the title. Gravity Games Bike Giant Snake Birthday Cake Large Fries Chocolate Shake was originally released for the PS2 and Xbox, with developer and publisher Midway planning to later launch it on the GameCube. Unfortunately, it was so bad and sold so poorly that the GameCube version never saw the light of day. Sorry, did I say unfortunately? I meant very, very fortunately. Number 25. Stalin vs. Martians, 23.14%. Well, at least if there's one thing you can say about Stalin vs. Martians, it's that it does exactly what it says in the title. The game placed players in command of Stalin's Red Army and tasked them with fighting off invading Martians. A simple, straightforward moniker, if ever we've heard one. Take note, Gravity Games Bike Street Vert Dirt. The year is 1942, and extraterrestrials have made their way to Earth and attacked Russia. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin is far too busy with other things to worry about such inconveniences though, and so he sends the player in to sort out the whole sorry mess on his behalf. Unlike traditional RTS titles, Stalin vs. Martians gameplay was fairly simplistic. Players sent their units out to kill their alien adversaries and were rewarded with gold and power-ups, the former of which could be spent on additional reinforcements and magic abilities. Yeah, for some reason Stalin had access to magic, whereas the latter boosted armor or attack power. On paper, the game didn't sound too bad, the sort of thing that might have been a bit of a cult hit with its straightforward gameplay and irreverent humor. Alas, the execution was way off, and so what players ended up with was a poorly constructed, buggy, unfunny mess of a game. Just 3 months after its release, Stalin vs. Martians was pulled from Steam without explanation. Good news for fans of complete train wrecks though, a sequel, Stalin vs. Martians 4, is currently in the works. Yippee. Number 24, Dino Dini's Kickoff Revival, 23.11%. It's a pity Ben's not covering this entry because it's the last sports time game that we're talking about in today's video. That's all you're getting from me, I'm not doing any more than that. Indeed, we have now come to the absolute worst sports title ever made. The Kickoff series of football games has been around since 1989, and between then and 2002, half a dozen titles bearing the Kickoff moniker were released. The franchise remained dormant throughout the 2000s, until it was announced in 2015 that Dino Dini, the developer responsible for the first few games, was bringing it back. Most wish he hadn't bothered. One of the main problems with Dino Dini's Kickoff Revival was the fact that the developer had tried to faithfully recreate the gameplay of previous titles. Now, whilst that style went over quite well in the 90s, with modern players who were used to the gameplay of titles like FIFA and Pro Evolution Soccer, it went down like a lead balloon. In addition to the outdated gameplay, Kickoff Revival suffered from the usual bad game issues, including awful visuals and a ton of glitches. Somebody probably needs to sign a DNR order before Dino tries to resuscitate this series once again. Number 23, Fighter Within, 23%. You know, I honestly thought we'd see more games on this list for Microsoft's ill-fated Kinect, but as it turns out, only 2 titles supported by the peripheral were bad enough to earn themselves a spot amongst the worst of the worst. Maybe the Kinect wasn't as bad as we think it was. No, it was definitely terrible. Fighter Within was a launch title for the Xbox One, and the follow-up to 2010's Fighters Uncaged for the Xbox 360, a game that was also rubbish, though not quite bad enough to place amongst the worst of all time. The game saw players controlling Matt, though we use the word controlling very loosely, a man who joins his local dojo and must fight various mopey opponents in order to prove his worth. The main issue with Fighter Within was the fact that the Kinect controls simply did not work. Allegedly, Matt could perform a variety of different moves, but the vast majority of the time, the Kinect failed to register what the player was trying to do, and so the protagonist just stood there like a lemon. Even if the controls had worked though, Fighter Within still wouldn't have been very good, owing to its uninspired design, boring gameplay, and subpar visuals. Number 22, Flat Out 3, Chaos and Destruction, 23%. You know what really pains us here at Team TripleJump? It's not the new IPs or the movie tie-ins that turn out to be terrible. No, it's when a once great franchise takes a nosedive, as was the case with the Flat Out series, thanks to 2011's Flat Out 3, Chaos and Destruction. The first Flat Out game released in 2004 to a reasonable critical reception. Players particularly enjoyed the Demolition Derby-style gameplay, realistic destruction, and overall sense of fun that the title provided. Flat Out 2 followed in 2006, which refined the formula and fared even better with critics than the original. Sadly, developer Bugbear Entertainment decided to step away from the franchise following the release of Flat Out 2, and so development duties for Flat Out 3 moved to Team 6 Game Studios, and to say that they completely fluffed it would be an understatement. To put it simply, Flat Out 3 was completely devoid of anything that would have made it playable. The first of Flat Out 3's many problems were its horrible controls, which one reviewer likened to the I'll Take Her mission in Grand Theft Auto 4. You know, the one where Nico kidnaps Gracie and she keeps grabbing hold of the steering wheel. The game was also criticised for the speed at which races took place, which was far too fast for anyone besides the Flash or Quicksilver to be able to keep up with, as well as the wonky physics, obsolete visuals, and myriad bugs. In summary, Flat Out 3 Chaos and Destruction was a masterclass in how to kill a franchise. Number 21, Homie Rollers, 23%. Do you remember Homies? I won't be hugely surprised if you don't, to be honest. They were a line of little plastic toys depicting various different Mexican-American characters, and first went on sale in 1998. They were quite popular in the late 90s and early 2000s, but like most toys, their popularity didn't last forever. Weirdly then, some 10 years after the figurine's initial release, kart racer Homie Rollers hit the Nintendo DS. To call the game a Mario Kart clone without shame would be something of a disservice to Mario Kart, as not only was Homie Rollers not in the same league as everyone's favourite kart racer, it wasn't even playing the same sport. There was nothing original to be had in the gameplay here. Players chose from one of 10 different homies before hitting the track and facing off against several adversaries, either human or AI, depending on whether or not they could convince their friends to buy a copy. Points were accrued by winning, and these could be spent on vehicle customizations. It's one thing for a game to be entirely derivative, but Homie Rollers was both derivative and poor quality, so it neither had any original ideas, nor did it execute the ideas it stole competently. The controls lacked precision, the camera did what it liked, and the races themselves were obscenely difficult thanks to the fact that the AI cars could make much sharper turns than the players. The question that keeps coming back when you look at Homie Rollers is why? Why is it so bad? Why is it so derivative? And why, oh why, did someone make a Homies game in 2008?
Number 20, Charlie's Angels, 23%. We're off to movie tie-in land again, folks, as we take a look at the utterly egregious Charlie's Angels for the Nintendo GameCube. The beat-em-up was based on the 2000 film of the same name, and follows Alex Munday, Dylan Sanders, and Natalie Cook as they embark on a mission to solve a mystery surrounding the disappearance of a number of national monuments. We recommend trying not to think too hard about the logistics of stealing the Statue of Liberty. You'll give yourself a headache. Critics were not kind to Charlie's Angels, mostly because everything about it screamed lazy cash grab. The controls were outdated and clunky, the visuals were subpar, and although the sound in the FMV segments was half decent, the rest of the game's audio was nothing to write home about. However, perhaps the worst sin committed by Charlie's Angels was the fact it was completely lacking the charm of its movie counterpart. Now, don't get us wrong, Charlie's Angels the movie wasn't exactly Citizen Kane, but it was a cool, stylish and action-packed romp starring 3 of the decade's biggest icons, and Bill frickin' Murray. Charlie's Angels the game, on the other hand, was soulless, repetitive, dull, and had about as much charm as hair in your shower drain. Yuck. Number 19, Rambo the video game, 23%. And now for another horrible movie tie-in with 2014's Rambo the video game. The arcade-style title sees players jumping into the shoes of iconic movie character Rambo and has them fighting their way through a series of scenes from the first 3 Rambo movies. Gameplay-wise, the whole thing was on rails, and players needed to utilise a variety of weapons and cover in order to best their foes and avoid taking damage. Rambo the video game didn't garner impressive review scores on any platform, scraping a dismal 34 and 28 out of 100 for its PC and Xbox 360 releases respectively. But on PS3, it received a critical battering. The first issue with Rambo the video game was the fact there was little variety in the gameplay. Every so often, a stealth segment would be peppered in, but for the most part, players were simply tasked with shooting everything in sight. This guns-a-blazing approach could have been fun for a section or two, but when it's the entire game, it loses its appeal. As if the boring and repetitive gameplay weren't enough, the graphics were poor, the whole thing was full to bursting with quick time events, and to top it all off, it was riddled with bugs and glitches. Number 18, Superman, The New Superman Adventures, 22.9%. Oh, come on. You knew that this one was going to show up eventually, it was just a matter of when. To be honest, we're a little shocked that Superman The New Adventures is placed so low on our list as number 18. It's often cited alongside the likes of E.T. the Extraterrestrial and Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 as one of the worst games ever made. So, at least we know the next 17 must be really crap. Released for the Nintendo 64 in 1999, Superman The New Superman Adventures saw players leaping into the tight spandex of the titular Kryptonian hero. Big Bad Lex Luthor has captured Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen and Professor Hamilton and trapped them in a virtual reality version of Metropolis, so it's up to Superman to break them free and save the day. Despite selling like veritable hotcakes, Superman did not fare very well with critics. The fog-laden levels, nonsensical and uninspired missions and confusing controls all caught flack from various different publications, as did the infamous Rings stage. The game did go down well with its target audience though, and so whilst it may have been panned by professionals, over 70% of children aged between 6 and 11 thought it was the bee's knees. Somewhat bizarrely, despite being utterly plops, Superman, The New Superman Adventures isn't the worst superhero game ever made. No, that accolade goes to number 17, Batman Beyond, Return of the Joker, 22.12%. We told you, didn't we? We said we hadn't seen the worst old Brucey Dubs has to offer, and here's the proof. It may surprise you to learn that Batman Beyond Return of the Joker is actually based on an animated movie, which, by all accounts, is really rather good. The film stars Kevin Conroy, Mark Hamill and Arlene Sorkin, actors who would later go on to reprise their roles as Bruce Wayne, the Joker and Harley Quinn respectively in 2009's Batman Arkham Asylum. Sadly, the trio of stars were not utilised for Batman Beyond Return of the Joker, though even their talents couldn't have saved this game from being a complete load of tripe. Players become new Batman Terry McGinnis as he takes over the role from the retired Bruce Wayne and fights the gang known as the Jokers, who are led by, you guessed it, Two-Face. Just kidding, it's the Joker. Critics were able to find a small amount of praise for the game. Admittedly, this was just directed towards the cutscene and the multiple batsuit mechanic, but still, at least it wasn't all bad. These elements made up but a minute fraction of the title though, and pretty much everything else was lambasted, including its lackluster graphics, repetitive gameplay, and grating sound. Sure, players got to witness the return of the Joker, but it's probably fair to say that if this is the best he has to offer, most wished he'd have stayed dead. Number 16, Fast and Furious Showdown, 22%. If I asked you to choose a couple of words to describe the Fast and Furious franchise, which ones would you go with? I assume you'd probably say something like exciting or action-packed, and not lifeless or boring. Clearly there was some breakdown in communication somewhere in the development of this 2013 movie tie-in, because Fast and Furious Showdown is neither fast nor furious or any good. The game featured many recognisable faces from the series, though Vin Diesel's character Dom Toretto was somewhat conspicuous with his absence, and tasked players with embarking on a series of car-based missions, some of which players would recognise from the movies. Perhaps the most notable flaw exhibited by Fast and Furious Showdown was its complete inability to convey speed, and the actual races felt more like driving Miss Daisy than Gone in 60 Seconds. Yes, I know it's an entirely different franchise, but I was sick of saying Fast and Furious. The boring gameplay would have been enough to make Fast and Furious Showdown a bad title, in and of itself, but its awful graphics, painfully long load times, and soulless voice acting truly sealed the deal. Sure, the game was a bargain title, but even if the devs had paid people to play it, it still wouldn't have been worth their time. Fast and Furious Showdown, more like Fast and Furious Letdown, got them. Number 15, Swamp Buggy Racing, 21.36%. More racing shenanigans now, only this time they're of the Swamp Buggy variety. How exciting! Swamp Buggy Racing was a PC title that, thankfully for the rest of us, would never make its way out of North America. The premise was thus. Players choose from one of 4 swamp buggies before taking them for a spin around one of 2 courses. There were only 3 modes to pick from, either single race, heat race, or practice mode, and there was no multiplayer option, which, in fairness, probably wasn't a drawback, as you'd have likely lost friends had you foisted Swamp Buggy Racing upon them. There wasn't a single thing about Swamp Buggy Racing that critics could find to love. Naturally, the lack of variety when it came to cars and tracks was the big problem, with some critics saying it felt more like a demo than a full game. It also suffered from some serious wonky physics, poor collision detection, subpar foggy graphics, janky controls, and grating, irritating music. Somewhat hilariously for a title called Swamp Buggy Racing, the game also suffered from a plethora of bugs and glitches, though I suppose in that sense, you could say that players couldn't really be disappointed, as it did exactly what it said on the box. Still, even had your expectations been absolutely zero, you'd have still come away from Swamp Buggy Racing feeling very shortchanged. Number 14, Afro Samurai 2, Revenge of Kuma, Volume 1, 21%. When the original Afro Samurai released in 2009, it received a fairly tepid response from critics. It garnered a score of 65 out of 100, but sold around 420,000 copies, which was enough to secure it a sequel. Sadly, Afro Samurai 2 Revenge of Kuma Volume 1 was about as well received as a birthday card filled with cold custard. Don't think too hard about that analogy, I can assure you, our writer didn't. The story of Afro Samurai 2 follows on from that of the first game. The titular Afro has attained the number 1 headband, and is challenged for it by player character Kuma, who, as the title suggests, is on a quest for revenge. Many publications listed Afro Samurai 2 amongst their worst games of the year, though, if we're going based off its metascore, it's actually only the second worst in 2015. Don't worry, we'll come to the absolute worst very shortly. Amongst the complaints were broken and buggy gameplay, a nonsensical, melodramatic, and oftentimes incomprehensible narrative, near constant frame rate issues, and a very dodgy camera. The silver lining in all of this is that the failure of Afro Samurai Revenge of Kuma Volume 1 meant that its sequels Volumes 2 and 3 were cancelled, so no one was forced to endure their shoddiness. In fact, the game was so bad that just 2 months after its release, it was pulled from the PSN store and Steam. Number 13, Drake of the 99 Dragons, 20.48%. Although it didn't have nearly as many exclusives as the PlayStation 2, Microsoft's original Xbox console did still have plenty of wonderful titles that were exclusive to the platform. Unfortunately, Drake of the 99 Dragons was not one of them. The game focuses its attention on the eponymous Drake, an undead assassin who embarks on a quest to avenge his murdered gang, the 99 Dragons, by recovering an ancient artifact stolen by antagonist Tang. Whilst the premise sounds like it could have been really solid, the execution was way off. In particular, critics chastised Drake of the 99 Dragons for its frustrating gameplay, which included a very poorly implemented dual-wield system with some seriously bad auto-aim mechanics. This was scrapped in the 2018 PC port, but in the end, helped the game's quality very little. In addition to its shoddy mechanics, the title also garnered criticism for its horrible voice acting, low-quality graphics and sound, and incomprehensible storyline, which wasn't helped in any way by the disjointed cutscenes. Initially, there had been plans for an entire multimedia franchise based on Drake and his many exploits, which would have included a series of comic books and animated TV show. Regrettably, Drake of the 99 Dragons was so poor, the entire idea was scrapped. Number 12, Skydive, 20.33%. If you're into such things, then skydiving is a hugely exhilarating extreme sport. Most people, our writer included, prefer to keep their feet firmly on the ground though, and so, if they're looking for an approximation of what it might be like to throw oneself out of an aeroplane, they'll need to turn to video games. Sadly, 1999's Skydive, or Skydive Go Ahead and Jump if you want to get serious about this, was approximately as exciting as shopping for laundry detergent, if not less so. Ooh, cotton breeze, delightful. The game came with a whopping 3 modes, all of which involved leaping from a plane before attempting to either land on a specific spot, fly through rings, oh god, the Superman flashbacks, or just do flips in the air. And that was all that Skydive had to offer. None of the modes were particularly challenging, and once they'd been played through once, there was really no excuse to come back to them. Sure, there were several different locations to visit, but they didn't add to the experience whatsoever. If you were a skydiving enthusiast, you'd have found Skydive about as thrilling as watching paint dry. If you weren't a skydiving enthusiast, it's really hard to say whether you'd gotten any more out of the game than someone who was. On one hand, you've probably got no frame of reference for how exciting the pastime is, but on the other hand, the title would have offered absolutely nothing to pique your interest. Either way, it wasn't worth playing. Number 11, Deal or No Deal, 20%. Some game shows lend themselves quite well for the video game format. For example, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, whilst not the greatest game ever made, works nicely because, well, who doesn't love a good quiz? Deal or No Deal, on the other hand, doesn't translate so successfully, because no matter how competent of a studio you are, it's pretty difficult to make opening boxes interesting. Alas, Deal or No Deal for the DS didn't even have decent developers at the helm, or at least, if they were decent, they clearly didn't give a flying flip about the game. The aim of Deal or No Deal was pretty straightforward. Simply open boxes and try to find the one that has the largest amount of cash inside. There was no skill involved, only sheer dumb luck. Actually, scratch that last remark, because after playing this game once, the mystery was removed, as the boxes would reset each time the DS was shut down, meaning that players always knew exactly where the big money was. Deal or No Deal was not only dull, boring and repetitive with an equally dull and boring premise, but it was also fundamentally broken. And to add insult to injury, it wasn't even a budget title, making it perhaps the worst deal in history.
Number 10. Alone in the Dark, Illumination, 19%. When you purchase a horror game, you expect to a certain extent at least to be in some way horrified by its contents. Clearly, the good folks behind Alone in the Dark Illumination were privy to this memo, though they failed to clarify that the game was supposed to be scary rather than scarily bad. Now, in fairness, the Alone in the Dark franchise has not been great for some time, so people probably weren't expecting much out of 2015's Illumination, though they were probably expecting something approaching a playable game. The game is set in Lorich, Virginia, a desolate town left abandoned after a flood. Players must investigate the town following reports of mysterious creatures that seem to be haunting the fog-laden town. In terms of gameplay, it was up to the players to take on the role of one of 4 different character archetypes before heading into the town to fight off the monsties by creating light sources, hence the Illumination part of the game's title. Alone in the Dark Illumination did not have a pleasant experience when it came face to face with critics, some of whom compared it unfavorably to Resident Evil 6. Do you know how bad of a horror game you have to be compared unfavorably with the worst main Resident Evil title? Pretty gosh darned awful. You name it, Illumination did it wrong. From boring gameplay to outdated graphics, the third-person shooter had it all. Let's just hope the upcoming Alone in the Dark reimagining is able to revive the series. Not holding my breath, to be honest. Number 9. Infestation Survivor Stories, aka The War Z, 18.89%. An open-world game in which the objective is simply to survive alongside your mates post-zombie apocalypse sounds like it could be great. And it is if you're playing something like State of Decay. If you instead chose to play Infestation Survivor Stories, you'd have been in for a real rough time. The game was originally released in 2012 under the name The War Z, or Z if you want to get British about this, but this was later changed to Infestation Survivor Stories, presumably to prevent it from being associated with the 2006 horror novel World War Z. Gameplay-wise, the idea was for players to try to survive in a zombie-infested world by collaborating with other players and scavenging for weapons and items. Safe zones gave players a break from all of the carnage, but outside of these, both PvE and PvP were fair game. The game's alpha release was met with a generally warm reception, and despite a few bugs, which is typical of an alpha anyway, players looked forward to the full release. Sadly, the final product failed to live up to its promising start. It seemed like none of the bugs or glitches had been addressed. Hacking and cheating were rife, with the devs doing absolutely nothing to stop it, and the whole game was based on one of the worst microtransaction systems we've ever seen. Here we go, are you ready? Players could spend real-world money on weapons and items that other players could then loot from them if they were killed, and once they were taken, that was it. Gone. Trust us, actually getting bitten by a zombie would be more fun than playing Infestation Survivor Stories, okay? Number 8. Spogs Racing, 18%. The Nintendo Wii was a fine little machine, wasn't it? Home to some of the best games of the generation, including the likes of Wii Sports and Super Mario Galaxy, this dinky white box was a games console that everyone could enjoy. As you all well know though, we can't always have nice things, and despite playing host to some truly wonderful titles, the Wii also had its fair share of duds, including Spogs Racing, which is, according to our chums over at Metacritic, the absolute worst Nintendo Wii game of all time. Well done there. If you're not sure what a SPOG is, then allow me to educate you. The acronym stands for Sports Player Object Gyros. And knowing this doesn't bring you any closer to understanding what it actually is. Basically, it's a POG surrounded by a wheel, and it was up to players to race them. The twist on the traditional racing formula was that the players could crash into other SPOGs in order to steal their parts for upgrades, and it could have been a fun way to waste half an hour had the execution not been completely bungled. The game was dubbed shovelware by many a publication, and critics lambasted Spogs Racing for its dull and boring gameplay, infuriating AI, and insultingly bad graphics and sound. Some did give the title props for the idea behind the crash and grab mechanic, but equally, a good idea done poorly was arguably worse than not having any fresh ideas at all.
Number 7. Vroom in the Night Sky, 17%. By 2017, video games had been commercially available to the public for over 45 years, and you'd think, in that time, developers would have come to understand what players wanted and what they didn't. Alas, the industry seldom seems to learn from its own mistakes, and that's why, even into the 8th and 9th generations of consoles, we still get lumbered with crud like Vroom in the Night Sky. Released in 2017 as a launch title for the Nintendo Switch, Vroom in the Night Sky plopped players into the shoes of magical girl Luna, a young woman who must collect stardusts in order to open a mystical portal known as the Magical Gate. The first thing the players noticed upon booting up the game was just how poor the translations were. Now, don't get us wrong, we appreciate that speaking a second language is tough, but you'd think for a product to be sold to discerning consumers, that developer and publisher Poisoft, if that's how you say it, would have gotten in a professional to sort the English subtitles, rather than relying on Google Translate. Because of the issues with the translation, players also found that they couldn't understand the story. Plus, the game suffered from serious control problems and had very little in the way of content to offer. All we can say is thank God for Breath of the Wild, because if it had been left to Vroom in the Night Sky, the Switch wouldn't have sold a single unit. Number 6. Yaris, 17%. Over the years, we players have seen many an adver game, i.e. titles whose purpose it is not to just entertain, but also to sell a product. The vast majority aren't exactly what you'd call good, but there are some, such as Chex Quest, that aren't bad. Then, there are titles like Yaris for the Xbox 360, a game so rubbish that it would have undoubtedly put people off buying the Toyota that it was attempting to peddle. Somewhat confusingly, rather than coming up with a game that demonstrated what the Yaris could actually do, the teams behind the 2007 title opted to make the thing a sort of futuristic racing game where the dinky little car had a ginormous claw-like gun strapped to the front of it. Not sure that feature comes as standard. The gameplay consisted of driving a mutant Yaris around various tracks whilst picking up coins and shooting enemies. You know, just like on your average commute. Now, in fairness, Yaris was offered on Xbox Live Arcade for the low price of free, but by all accounts, even that was far too much. Its flaws included low-quality graphics, poor controls, and broken online play. Though we really do question why they even bothered with online play at all, as though players would have been falling over themselves to party up for a fun evening of Yaris. Number 5. Little Britain, the video game, 16%. Those of you out there who enjoy statistics will probably be interested to know which year had the most entries in this list. And it's my pleasure to reveal that 2007 was the worst for terrible video games, apparently. With a whopping 13 entries, the year 2007 takes up over 12% of our list. I'd like to say good going 2007, but the achievement is really nothing to be proud of. In a year that gave us the likes of Chicken Shoot, Jenga World Tour, and the OG Game Party, it must have been difficult to release a game that stood out for its abhorrence. But by golly, did the folks behind Little Britain the video game give it a darn good shot, producing not only the worst title of 2007, but the 5th worst ever made. Bravo indeed. Little Britain the video game played out in a similar way to an episode of the show, with several mini-games coming together like sketches to form an episode. These included CD collecting with Vicky Pollard, a diving challenge starring Lou and Andy, and a Pac-Man-style supermarket dash with Fat Fighter's Marjorie Dawes. Now, if you ask pretty much anyone at TripleJump, you'll find that we think Little Britain itself is about as funny as Toothache, but there are some people out there that found it and still find it entertaining. Little Britain the video game, on the other hand, made its TV show counterpart look like Monty Python, and I think even fans of the sitcom would struggle to get anything out of this abomination. Not only was the game completely unfunny, but the mini-games themselves were bland and uninteresting, the graphics and animations were some of the worst that critics had seen in a game, and it was insultingly short, though admittedly that could be taken as a positive. To quote Andy, "I don't like it."
Number 4, Leisure Suit Larry box office bust, 16%. If we take a look all the way back to the 80s, we'll find a Leisure Suit Larry title that isn't completely plops. Indeed, 1987's Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards wasn't half bad if you're a fan of cheeky humour. But since then, the series has gone rapidly downhill and hit an all-time low in 2009's Leisure Suit Larry box office bust. The game follows the exploits of Larry Lovage, the nephew of the series' original Larry, as he embarks on a string of odd jobs and tries to uncover a mole sent to sabotage his uncle's movie studio. The first of the game's many problems was that it simply wasn't funny. Admittedly, the franchise's humour isn't the sort that applies to everyone, but it has its fans. Box Office Bust mistook shock value for hilarity, and rather than being comedic, it just came off as vulgar and immature. Things didn't get much better when it came to gameplay, as players were greeted with repetitive levels and unresponsive controls. Every so often, a minigame would be peppered in to break things up, some of which critics found to be entertaining, but they were too few and far between to save the game. Throw into the mix some of the ugliest graphics we've ever seen, and you've got yourself a game that truly lives up to its title. Number 3, Double Dragon 2, Wonder of the Dragons, 15.83%. Now, before we get into this one, we need to make an important distinction. For this entry, we aren't talking about 1988's Double Dragon 2 The Revenge, the classic arcade title that was, by all accounts, not half bad. Double Dragon 2 Wonder of the Dragons, on the other hand, is an insult to the very franchise to which it belongs. Released exclusively for the Xbox 360 via the Xbox Live Arcade, Double Dragon 2 Wonder of the Dragons is loosely based on the original Double Dragon 2. Its premise may have been similar, but aside from that, it bore no resemblance to its source material. The first clue to the cruddiness of this game was on the Live Arcade itself. As its overview read, this is a remake. Double Dragon 2, a 80s game. The storyline takes same as the original game story. However, the graphic, character, action, system, etc. are change. A poorly translated blurb doesn't necessarily make a bad game. And thankfully for this list, Wonder of the Dragons went wrong in far more places. Despite being rebuilt from the ground up, the game retained all of the problems from its arcade predecessor, and sprinkled in a few more for good measure. Enemies would fly off screen and become unreachable, and they'd often attack while the player was trying to get back up. Wonder of the Dragons also suffered from myriad technical problems, slowing to a crawl if too much was happening on screen, and outright crashing if it got too overwhelmed. Number 2, Ride to Hell Retribution, 15%. I know, we're as shocked as you are. We genuinely thought that Ride to Hell Retribution would be taking the top spot, having made many a worst of all time list in its day. But alas, it's so rubbish that it can't even win at being awful. Originally, Ride to Hell Retribution was to be an open-world game, but after being stuck in development hell for 5 years, it finally released in 2013 as a linear action title. The game centres on Jake Conway, a Vietnam veteran who becomes embroiled in a biker gang war after rivals kill his brother and shoot Jake, leaving him for dead. It would probably be quicker to list the things that Ride to Hell Retribution did well than it would to list all the things it got wrong, so here goes. In all seriousness, this game was hung, drawn and quartered by critics, who complained about its repetitive, barely functional gameplay, wonky controls, out-of-date graphics, laughable writing and worse voice acting, and, my god, those cringe-inducing sex scenes. Any one of these things alone would have made Ride to Hell Retribution a painful experience, but when combined, resulted in a title that was the video game equivalent of syphilis. Despite that, it still wasn't the absolute worst game ever made. No, that accolade goes to the very deserving.
Number 1. Family Party 30 Great Games Obstacle Arcade, 11%. Well, here it is, folks, the absolute worst game ever made. More broken than Ride to Hell Retribution, more boring than Skydive, and more likely to lose you friends than Game Party Champions. We're not giving out prizes for the absolute worst of the worst, but if we were, the obnoxiously titled Family Party 30 Great Games Obstacle Arcade would be the lucky recipient of a one-way trip to Switzerland to be euthanized.
As its lengthy moniker might suggest, Family Party 30 Great Games Obstacle Arcade comprised a series of mini-games that ranged from shooting balloons out of the sky to something akin to that terrifying glass bridge challenge from Squid Game. So what was wrong with this utter disappointment of a product? What was right with it were probably more of an appropriate question. Critics directed their complaints at the game's horrendously outdated graphics, poor controls, irritating voice acting, and borderline unplayable mini-games.
To get an understanding of how enjoyable Family Party was to play, imagine being locked in a windowless room and having your teeth pulled out one by one without anaesthetic. Actually, even that might have been more fun than being forced to endure this steaming turd of a game. So, without further ado, I crown thee, Family Party 30 Great Game Obstacle Arcade, the very worst game ever made. It's going to take something pretty special to snatch that title, but I have every confidence that some horrid developer somewhere out there is up to the task.